The C# crash course video on this channel has been getting quite a bit of attention. So what I wanted to do with this video is delve a bit deeper into more advanced C# topics. So today we're going to be covering the .NET Entity Framework, or otherwise known as efcore. What we'll be doing is building a basic console app that's going to be a blog manager, which will allow us to manage blogs as well as posts associated with each blog. So as you can see here in the console, here in the terminal, we have various options that we can select from. We can add a new blog site. We can get all blogs as a list. We can also add a post that's associated with a specific blog site. We can also get all of the posts related to that specific blog site. We can update and delete a single post. So we're going to keep things rather simple. We're not going to generate a separate UI for this. This is just solely going to focus on database work. Let's hit that intro. So before we put our fingers to keyboards, it's important to understand exactly what Entity Framework is. So entityframeworkcore, or efcore as the shortened form, is an object relational mapper, and it allows us to either write code from which we can generate database tables, or if we have an existing database, we can generate the code that directly maps to the database tables. And this allows us to build very scalable, clean data structures and schemas using this framework. And it's a quicker way to build a database, because without Entity Framework, you'd be stuck building your own database tables and manually creating each and every field or attribute on every database table, and that could be quite time consuming. So using an object relational mapper or an ORM like Entity Framework allows us to work much more quickly as developers, and thus building very scalable applications. So as I mentioned before, we're going to be building in this video this particular app here, which is a blog manager, and we have different options here. So let me just kind of demonstrate how this would work. So once we have the final built product, we can do something like add a new blog site. So if I type the number 1 here and hit enter, then it's going to ask me to give the name of the blog site. So let's just call this blog site 1 and hit enter. Now it's going to ask me to enter a URL, and this is all custom code that we build in this tutorial. So I'm just going to add a URL here, just a random one. Doesn't have to be a real one. So blogsite1.com, and I'll hit enter. And now, as you guys will see, it added this to the database, and we can check that if that worked. Let's just type Y here and enter. And if I type the number 2 to view all of the blogs, you guys will see here, actually I have some other entries here from prior testing. But basically here, we have a list of various blog sites that's added to the database. Now, if you want to see exactly what the database looks like, I've installed an extension here. Let me just open this up. Let's go to the site here. And what we're going to do is click on extensions right here. And if I type in here SQLite viewer, actually it's not the viewer, it's the editor, SQLite editor. If I click on that, I've installed this extension here, so I would say go ahead and install this in your Visual Studio Code. And I'm also going to add a couple of URLs below to Visual Studio Code if you need to install this, as well as the .NET framework for your computer. I'm on a Mac, and generally a lot of .NET applications are built in Windows environments, but with .NET Core and efcore, now we can build .NET applications in other environments, in other operating systems such as Mac OS or Linux. I just prefer to use a Mac by choice, but essentially you can install this extension in Visual Studio Code, SQLite 3, and then it will allow us to see the database table. So now if I wanted to see the data directly in the database table using this extension, I would just expand this DB folder, which I created, and in here we have an SQLite.db file. So if I open that up like this, it's going to show me the data that's in here. So right now, this is currently querying the post table. As you can see here at the top, we have the select star from posts, which essentially is going to select all of the rows in this database table. And currently we just have one entry, which here is the post 1. Now, if I were to change this to see all of the blogs as we saw below in the output, I'm going to select the blogs table, and now you guys can see we have 3 entries, which is what was showing below. So I'm going to show you guys exactly how to build this database table without the need of actually manually doing it. Essentially, we're going to be using EF models to build this, and we'll get a bit into that shortly. So without further ado, let's go ahead and spin up a brand new Visual Studio Code project and get cracking. So in typical Codiversity fashion, I currently have my terminal open, and what I'm going to do is create a brand new directory. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm on a Mac, so I would type in the command mkdir to create a new directory, and let's call this one ef-crash and hit enter, and then I'm going to cd into that directory by typing cd space ef-crash like that and hit enter. Because essentially what I want to do is create a separate folder for my Visual Studio project. So I'm going to come here now, and I'm going to type code and then dot to open up Visual Studio. All right, excellent. So now before we jump into the rest of the project, there's a few things we'll have to get installed to make this work. Now, historically, C# projects were built using Visual Studio, which is just the general IDE that's being used for C# applications. But most recently, as of the time of this video, Microsoft has built a brand new extension called C# Dev Kit, which will allow us to write C# applications in Visual Studio Code. Now, the main perk of that is that we no longer have to just use a Windows to build our C# applications. We can now use different operating systems, whatever operating systems are supported by this extension. So to show you exactly what I mean, I'm going to go right back to extensions here. And as I already showed you guys the SQLite editor extension. You can go ahead and install that if you want. But what we're interested in now is the C#. So we'll type here C and then # dev kit. And I already have this installed. That's why we see a gear icon. But if I were to double click on that, this is basically the extension that you guys would want to install if you're going to use Visual Studio Code. Now, if you're going to use Visual Studio, which is the default or de facto IDE for C# applications, you don't have to do this. You can also, as an alternative, use JetBrains Writer, I believe it's called. I've never used it because I prefer to use Visual Studio Code because I love it and I'm most familiar with it. But if you guys are using JetBrains Writer, you can go ahead and use that. You can skip this step. So this C# Dev Kit, all you need to do is install this. Now, since I have it installed, I don't have to do that again, but basically this will allow us to quickly create C#.NET applications and solutions within our Visual Studio Code. So go ahead, get this installed. The other thing you want to install, if I flip back to the browser here, the other thing you want to make sure you have installed is the .NET framework. So if I scroll down here on this page, there is a link here, and I can link to this in the video description as well. But we have this .NET SDK. So if I open that up here, it'll take me to this page asking me to download the .NET SDK. You want to make sure you have this downloaded for the proper operating system that you're running on. So in this case, it's auto-suggesting Mac OS to me. So I've already have this installed, so there's not a need for me to do this. But once you guys go ahead and click install, or download and install, is going to also install the .NET CLI or command line interface. And that's important for us to run commands in the terminal within our Visual Studio Code instance. So again, you don't have to do this if you're on a Windows because Windows automatically comes pre-installed with .NET. So you should have the CLI by default, but if you don't, just look at some documentation and some other tutorials online on how to do that. This tutorial is focused on, it's essentially operating system agnostic, so essentially does not just favor Windows or Mac. That's the reason why I'm using a Mac, because if you're able to build a C# application on a Mac, you're able to do it on a Windows much more easily. So let me also say there is one other thing you guys should install here, and that's obviously Visual Studio Code. So I've already talked about this. If you're using Windows or Mac, you can install this. More than likely, if you're using a Windows, you'll probably prefer to install just Visual Studio Community Edition. So you guys can look that up, but I'm using Visual Studio Code for this tutorial. So go ahead and get that installed if you want to follow along to a T. And once you get that installed, as I mentioned, you can just install the C# Dev Kit extension as well as the SQLite editor extension. All right, so now I'm back here in Visual Studio, and we're going to need to run a couple of commands to set up our C# project. Now, essentially in C#.NET, we have something called a solution. And a solution is like a container that can have one or many projects within it. So generally for this tutorial, we're just going to create one project within a solution. But in a real world application in .NET, you may have 3, 4, 5 various projects within a solution. So a common architecture you'll see is the N-tier architecture, in which you'll have a solution, or rather a project in your solution, that has the data access layer, and then another project that has the business logic, and then another project that would have the UI or the view markup. But in this project, we're going to keep things simple because it's going to be a simple console app. So that's why we're going to just have one project within this solution. So first I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up the terminal. I'm going to click on terminal above and then new terminal here. And again, I'm on a Mac, so some of the menus may be slightly different. Just figure out exactly how to open up your terminal or your command line within a Windows environment or a Linux, whatever you're using. Now what I'm going to do here, let me just clear out the console, because we're going to type several commands. Now, in the prior clip, as I was showing you the browser, you should have installed the .NET framework. And basically, when you get that installed, it's going to come prepackaged with the .NET CLI. And this is what we're going to be using right now to create our C# solution. So first, to check to see if that's been installed correctly, I'm going to type here .NET -- version. If I hit enter, you'll see it returns to me that I'm using .NET version 8.0.100. So you basically want to make sure that something returns here, whether it's an earlier version or a later version or the same exact version, in order for these commands to work. Okay, so let me go ahead and clear that out. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to create a brand new console app solution. So to do that, we're going to type .NET new console. And what that's going to do is going to create a brand new .NET solution within our current directory. So if I hit enter and give that a few, you'll notice here that it's creating a brand new tree structure here, which contains several files, as well as a folder called OBJ. So if you look here on the left, we have this OBJ folder. If I expand that, we have several different files. These are mainly configuration files, so we don't have to be concerned with these right now. But basically, we also have a program.cs file. Now, this file is intended to be the very first point of contact for the .NET application. So when you run this application, is going to look within this file first, because this is where our main method will be kept. So we'll be writing our main method shortly, but for right now, just know that the program.cs file is a C# class file in which we'll have the very first lines of code that will get executed by the .NET framework. Let me just close this out for now, because we don't have to be concerned with that yet. So now what we want to do is install a few plugins that we're going to be using. Now, I have some notes here on the side because some of these commands are rather long. So let me just clear out this console again so you guys can see them. We're going to go through them one by one. So the very first plugin or package that we would like to install is the database driver package. So we're going to be using SQLite, or Sqlite as some developers call it. And basically Sqlite is a lightweight database that's used in .NET applications. It can also be used in other frameworks as well. Alternatively, in like a production environment, you may not want to use Sqlite. You might want to use another solution such as SQL Server or SQL Server. MySQL or PostgreSQL is another option that you can use in production, because Sqlite, while it is very lightweight and easy to use, it is not optimal to be used in production where you'll have a lot of data being stored. So, but for dev purposes, we can go ahead and install it here. So let me just paste in this command. And the command that we're going to be running here is .NET add package Microsoft.entityframeworkcore.sqlite. So go ahead and pause the video and type out this entire command right now. So now I'm going to hit enter to run this command. And what it's going to do is install this package so that we can use an SQL database or SQLite database within our solution. All right. Good, so that looks like it's been installed. So the next thing we want to do is we want to install a global package. So let me clear this console. And the global package we're going to install, if I paste this command right now, is .NET tool install -- global and .NET-ef. And basically, I've already installed this, but this is going to install the .NET-ef package globally on your computer. So this is going to be pretty much kept within the application cache in your computer. And installing this will allow us to work with the .NET framework together with Entity Framework, so that way we can access our data. So if I hit enter, it's going to give me an error message because I already have that installed. But for you, you should see no error message here. It should work perfectly once you get that installed. Okay, lastly here, we're going to install the design package. So let me just grab that, and let me just clear out the console again. And you basically go ahead and pause the video. You basically want to add this command here, which is .NET add package Microsoft.entityframeworkcore.design. And this is another package that we'll need in order for our projects to recognize the entity framework together with communicating with the database. So let me go ahead and install that, and that's going to install this package locally as well, just like we installed the Sqlite package. All right, so we've gotten all the packages I believe that we needed to install. Let's go ahead and clear this out, because next what we want to do is let's create a couple of folders here, because I'd like to keep everything nice and tidy here. So let's create 3 folders. One folder we'll create is going to be called context. And basically in this folder, what we're going to keep is the blogging context file that's responsible for handling the database request. So let me create a new file by clicking on this new file icon here on the left. I'm just going to create a new, not file, but rather folder called context. So make sure that this is a folder, guys, not a file. Contexts. So I'll hit enter there. And in there, we're going to have a brand new file. But for now, I'm just going to create the folders. Next, we want to just make sure that we unselect that. And then next, what we want to do is create another folder called DB. And that's going to be where the database itself will be stored. So let me just create DB and hit enter. Make sure that this DB folder is in the root directory of your project, not within the context directory. This is very important. Okay, and then finally, the last folder we're going to create here is called models. Just like this, and I'll hit enter. And basically, this models folder will have 2 files or 2 classes, post and blog. And this is basically the models that we'll construct to communicate directly with the database via Entity Framework. Okay, so now we've gotten that installed. The next thing we need to do is actually add the files to these folders. Now, I could just simply come here and say new file and then add the files manually one by one, or through magic, I can use the .NET CLI to do the same thing. So the first, let's create our blogging context file first. So I'll come down here and I'll type .NET new. And what we want to create is a class file, because we want this file to end in .cs as an extension. So we'll type here a class, and then this class will pass in a -n parameter to give it a name. That's what the n means. And we'll call this blogging context. And then we're going to pass in a -o because we need to specify in which folder this file will be stored. And that's going to be stored in our contexts folder. So spell everything out just as you see it here on the screen. And then once you got that typed out, if I hit enter, it'll go ahead and create that file. And if I expand it, you guys will see here on the left, it's created this blogging context.cs file, which has some boilerplate code to define a new public class. Now, one thing you want to kind of just be aware of is when you create these classes in the .NET CLI, just make sure you don't add the extension. So as I've done here, notice I did not type blogging context.cs, but just blogging context. And because we specify this as being a class, it'll automatically assign the correct extension. Cool. So that's the first file we need. So the second file, if I just press the up arrow, it'll bring back this command. So the second file we need, we're just going to change the name. We'll get rid of blogging context. The second file we'll need here is the blog file. So we'll just say -n and then blog with a capital B. And instead of the context folder, we want to put this in the models folder. Make sure you have that / there as well. So if I hit enter, it'll go ahead and create a file within the models folder. So let's just double check that it's there. If I expand models, you guys will see we have blog.cs here. And if I open that up, again, we have boilerplate code. Now, obviously, we're going to be coming back to these classes and adding in the logic that we'll need to create our entities or our models. And then we'll be migrating that to the database to create the database as well as the database tables. Okay, there's one more class we'll need in this same folder, so I'll hit the up arrow, and I can leave the folder as is. I'm just going to change the name here, get rid of blog, and I'm going to type post with a capital P, just like this, post. So if I hit enter, it'll create another model class here called post.cs, and again, we have our boilerplate code here. I'm not sure what happened there. Let me just double check. There it is. Okay, so we have our boilerplate code here, all right? So it looks like we've created all of the files that we'll need. Now, obviously, as we run the migrations, which we'll do a little bit later on, is going to add the database to the DB folder for us because we're going to set up our configuration in the blogging context file. All right, so we got our classes set up. So the next thing we're going to do, we'll take this step by step. Let's move on to populating our models because what we'll need to do is we'll need to create the fields within our models so that when we migrate to the database, it'll set up the correct tables for us as well as the fields associated with each table. So first I'm going to click on blog.cs, or you can just go to your models folder here and open up blog.cs. And there's a few things we'll need to declare in here to get this working. So the first thing we want to do here is just make sure that we always have our namespace at the top, because this namespace declaration on line number 1 is important for telling .NET exactly where to find your code in each and every file. And because we have a namespace here of ef crash, this is basically how this is going to work for us, right? It's going to associate everything with this ef crash namespace. So here, as you see, I have this boilerplate blog class defined as currently empty. There's no special logic here, but before we work with this, we need to define a couple of directives that we need to bring in, or references. So the first thing we need to do is we need to use a using keyword, and I'm going to bring in the system reference. Now this is a very common one because a system reference is exactly how we would be using the built-in .NET Core functions and references that we'll need to output to the console, for example, and various other things we'll need to do within this application. So this is a common one you'll be using often in .NET. The next thing we'll do is we'll bring in, again, using system, but this time we're going to bring in a sub namespace called .link, L-I-N-Q. Now, link is a special syntax within the .NET or C# world, and basically with link, this allows us to directly communicate with objects and database tables in easy-to-use syntax. Otherwise, if we didn't use link, we would have to use SQL statements and, for example, select all from or insert into statements, which could become rather lengthy and very convoluted. So working with link allows us to quickly query databases, quickly add and delete data from the database, very similar to working with JavaScript in a sense. All right, so the other thing we need to bring in is using Microsoft, and it's not going to give me the auto suggest, but that's fine. I remember what it is. So using Microsoft dot, I believe it's the entity framework core. Right? So we need to bring this in as well. Hopefully I spelled that correctly. If not, it'll give me a warning. But basically, we're going to bring in this Microsoft Entity Framework Core reference because without this, we won't be able to communicate with our database tables via efcore. So this is important to have in here. Okay? So now, again, as I said, we have this blog class. The first thing we need to do is define a couple of attributes which would be serving as our fields in a database table. So the first one I'll create is an ID field. I'm going to say here public, and this is going to be an integer or an int, which is a number, and we're going to say blog ID, and then we're going to set a getter and a setter here. And this is standard C# convention, this get and set. I'll come back to that shortly and explain how that works. But basically the way that Entity Framework Core works is that either you can define a field like an ID field like this, which is just ID, or you can define it as blog ID. Basically, the efcore framework will look for either ID or blog ID to determine which field should be the primary key of your database table. And primary key is basically the indexable key of your database table through which a lot of records could be queried, and it serves as a unique identifier to your database table's data. Okay, so this is why this field is very important. You can also override that by using like a key annotation, but I'm not going to show that right now because we're just going to be using the standard Entity Framework Core features and functionality. All right, so we define this as a unique key or a primary key. The next field that we'll need is a name field because we're going to be storing the blog name. So we're going to say public string name, and make sure that this is capitalized, guys. And we're going to do, again, get and set. And this is a string, a data type. Now, just to kind of backtrack here, one thing I wanted to cover really quickly is we're defining these getters and setters. Now, in the Java world and in other programming languages, you would often have, for example, you might have like a public method, public, let's say void, and then you would say like get blogs, for example, like a function like this in other programming languages. And then you would have like another one that would be like public void set, right? Set blogs. Maybe not the best example, or set blog name, for example. Maybe not the best example, but basically instead of having like a separate accessor and mutator or getter and setter, you would essentially define these using the get and set keywords in C#. And basically these are like kind of like underlying methods in itself, but these methods are directly attached to these properties. So for example, if you wanted to reference the name in a different file, since this is public, you could do something like object name.name or blog.name, for example, and it's going to return to you through this getter the name of this particular object. And then if you wanted to set the name, you would do blog.name is equal to and whatever value you wanted to assign. And this is basically the setter portion of this. And just to kind of let you know, even though we're not going to be doing this in this tutorial, you can actually use access modifiers. So for example, you can use private if you want this to be private for some reason to this file. So, there's many different essentially many different ways that you can work with these getters and setters. But for this tutorial, we're going to leave things nice and simple. Leave me some comments below if you want me to expand further on this in a different video. And while we're at it, now that I'm thinking of it, guys, make sure you like this video and subscribe and hit the bell icon if you love what I'm doing so far, because it's my goal to bring you guys more education and to teach you guys more about C# and other frameworks as well. So please show me some love and subscribe to this channel. Let's go ahead and move on. So we have our name attribute or our name property here. We're going to define one more, and it's going to be public, again a string, and it's going to be URL, and this is going to be the URL to our blog. And again, that's going to be a get and a set as well. And these getters and setters are public, by the way. Okay, so it looks like we've defined everything we needed to define here in terms of the fields. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and start creating the methods that we'll need to access the data and to mutate this data within our database. The reason why I'm going to do this now instead of later is because I want to show you guys how you can step-by-step define the behavior of this class and then kind of work through things in a very orderly fashion when designing your code. Because essentially, if we were to do something like test-driven development here, we would write the unit test first, and then we would write the method second before we write anything concerning the UI. So right now, I'm going to be working on the data access layer portion of this, as well as the business logic, and then we can worry about the console app UI last. So first, what we want to do is we want to have a method that fetches all of the information from the server. Okay, we want something that fetches everything from the database. So I'm going to define a public method. Let's see, we can say public list is going to return a list of blogs. And what we want to do is we just want to get all blogs. So we're just going to call this get all. And I'm going to come down here to a new line and then add my curly braces down here to follow a typical C# convention. All right. So we have this method here, and this is going to return a list of all blogs. So we're going to say list blog here, and we're going to call this blogs is equal to new, I think I mistyped something, is equal to new list of blog, like this. Now, one thing I want to point out here before we continue, I could have also just done this. If I take this out, I could have also just done var blogs, right? Because C# has this reserved keyword called var, which is very typical in old school JavaScript as well. And basically, if you don't want to statically type the type here, you can use the var keyword instead. But just to kind of demonstrate, I might use var in other places just to kind of demonstrate what we're doing here. I'll go ahead and I'll use this list just to be concretely descriptive of what this is going to return. So basically, this is all I'm doing here is I'm just creating and instantiating a new blog list object here. It's just going to contain a list of blogs. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the using keyword, because what we need to do is we need to write all of the code that we need to fetch the data within a using context so that we can open the database connection and close it after we're done. So I'm going to say here using var, and we're going to call the variable is DbContext, and I'm going to set that equal to a new, and we have our blogging context file. If you guys remember, we're going to set that to a new blogging context. And then I'm going to come down here, new line, and then curly braces here. And basically what this is going to do is instantiate a blogging context object so that we can communicate directly with the database. Now, we haven't defined the blogging context object or class yet. It's still currently empty, but we'll get to that last after we define the model. So if you're getting any error messages now, just ignore them for now. We'll get to that shortly. All right, so next what we need to do is in the event that we may have an error message, we need to have a try-catch block here just to be careful and to handle any error messages gracefully and output something to the screen if the user encounters an error. So I'm going to type here try, and then I'm going to hit enter and then open up a new block here. And then down here, I'll come down here and I'll type catch and then parentheses, and I'm going to just say exception EX. And then open that up like this. Now, generally, you can also just say system.exception, system, because this exception class comes from the system namespace. But because I'm bringing in using system up top, I don't need to say system.exception. So I think this should work. We'll give this a try. If it doesn't work, we'll bring in system.exception, but I believe it will work. All right, so let's go ahead and handle the exception first. So if we get a failure from the database, what we want to happen is just we want to output the error message to the user. So I'm going to say here, I'm going to use our console.writeLine function or method. Now, console.writeLine, guys, is basically within the system namespace of .NET. And basically what this method does, it outputs any kind of text or input, it outputs it to the screen. And then it adds a new line character to the end. If you want to exclude the new line character, you would just use console.write. But we're going to be using this quite a bit throughout this application because we're going to be working with the console. So obviously we'll need to have this everywhere throughout our application. Now what I want to do here is I want to be able to output the error message that's coming within this EX object. So to do that, I'm going to add a $ here because I want to interpolate that value within a string. So I'm going to use $ and then double quotes, a set of double quotes here. You want to make sure that these are double quotes in .NET because this is a string, not a character. Okay, so I'm going to say here error. Let's just say error while fetching blogs. And then in here, I'm going to use a set of curly braces. I'm going to say ex.message. And again, this is coming from that exception object above. That's going to output the error message for us. Okay. Now I'm going to come back up here and let's define the rest of our logic. Essentially, we're just going to have one line. So we've already instantiated the blogs list object above. So we're going to just say blogs is going to be equal to DbContext dot, and let's see, we're going to say DbContext dot blogs. We haven't created this property yet. We're going to create this in our DbContext shortly. So we're going to say DbContext dot blogs dot, and what we need to do is, because this blogs property is really going to be a database set or a DB set for short, which is a .NET data type, we need to convert that DB set to a list that we can use to output to the screen. So we're going to say to with a capital T and lowercase o, not sure what happened there, sorry, to list like this. Okay, and that's essentially all we need for this line here to make this work. And obviously what we need to do is we need to return this back to the caller. So outside of this using block, we're just going to say return blogs, and that should be it for this method, guys. Now, just really quickly, why did I not return within using? Well, you could, but if you return this within using, then you would have to return something down here. what I did instead is I instantiated a new list object here on line number 15. And the reason why I did that is I don't want this function or method to return null. I want it to return an empty list object in the event that the data does not get returned, like if we have an error message, for example. So whether we have data or not, we're going to return some sort of object, list object. The difference is if we do return data from the database, we're going to return a list full of various records within it. Otherwise, we're going to return an empty list. Cool. So this function should work, and we're going to test this out shortly. Let's go ahead and start defining our other methods here. Now, you're probably going to hear me use the words function and methods or method interchangeably here. They're essentially the same thing. It's just that in the .NET world, we often call them methods, okay? But they're basically functionality that defines behavior within the application. All right, so let me just go down here and make some new lines. So next up, what we need is we need a method that adds a new record to the database. It adds a new blog when we want to or when we choose to do so within the database. So I'm going to say here public, and I'm going to call this, I'm going to make this void so it won't return anything. We just want to add something to the database. So we're going to call this method add. And let's go down here and make a new line like this and curly braces. Now, this add functionality will take in a couple of parameters. So I'm going to come back up here to add. I'm going to say, first we're going to pass in a string of name, okay? And then we're going to pass in a URL. And this is going to come from the user's input because we're essentially going to prompt the user to enter in the name and the URL within our console app. So if you think of this in terms of a website, when you go on a website, you have the user input information into a form. And that information that they input into the form will then be passed to the back end, and then we'll do some manipulation if we need to, and then store that in the database. It's essentially the same concept here. Instead, we're just asking the user to input something into the console app, and then we're going to be passing those values into this add method. All right. So what we need to do now is we need to have, once again, our using, and we're going to say, and what I'm just going to do here just to kind of save some time, I'm going to come back up here, actually, and I'm just going to copy this entire line here, this using statement, and come back down here, and I'm just going to paste that in, and I'm just going to add my curly braces like that. All right, so within this context, we're going to have, again, another try. Now, I have some auto-suggest. I'm just going to go ahead and use that. So I'm going to hit enter on that, and it's going to populate my catch, and I'm just going to add the EX variable here. Now, if you notice, it added by default system.exception. I think that's okay to leave in, but just because we imported system above, I'll just get rid of system dot, just so that there's a lot of clarity here on what I'm trying to do. And again, down here, we'll define our catch. I'm going to say console.writeLine. So if there is an exception here, what we're going to do is, again, $, double quote. Let's see, what do we want to say here? Let's say here, error. Jeez, I can't type today. Error occurred while adding a blog site. And we're going to use curly braces again, and we're going to say ex.message. Now, generally, for something like this, for this kind of like similar functionality, ideally you would have like a separate function because it's essentially doing something similar to what's above, but it may be a little bit overkill to do that here. So we'll just continue to write that out as we go along. All right, so now to define the actual database call. So what we're going to do is here we need to add a new blog site or add a new blog essentially. Now the blog is synonymous with blog site. When we add a blog, it's basically going to be another location that will have a list of posts associated with it. So for now, let's just concentrate on adding the blog. So what do we have to do, guys? Well, first, I'm going to use that var keyword. I'm going to say new blog, and that's going to be equal to a new blog object. Okay? And I'm just going to come down here, and I'm going to use, I'm not sure what happened there. I'm just going to hit enter, and then add my curly braces here like that. Now, just before we go on, if you're wondering why I use var, I could have also just said here, blog object, blog new blog is equal to new blog. Whatever floats your boat. I'm just going to use var to get you guys acclimated to how to use var. You can use it as you wish. If you want it to be less concretely typed, you can use var. essentially it's going to do the same thing. You just have to be a little bit smarter with how you handle the data if you're not quite sure what the data type is. You might have to use some type checks in there. But essentially, okay, so what we're going to do is when we create a new blog, we just need to set the name. So we're going to say name, and that's going to be equal to the lowercase name that we're passing into this method, and then comma, and then we're going to say URL with the capital U is going to be set equal to the lowercase URL that we're passing into this method. And here I think we just need to have a semicolon, right? Okay, cool. All right, so that part is done. So now what we want to do is we want to add this new blog record to our DB set of blogs that's coming from the DbContext. So we're going to say dbcontext.blogs.add, not to be confused with this add function. This is a separate add function that comes as part of DB set, and we're just going to pass in the new blog object that we just created. Lastly, we need to save our changes. So we're going to say dbcontext.save changes, like that. And let me see, what else do I want to do? Let's add a console.writeLine here. So we're going to say console.writeLine, and just as a confirmation that this has worked, because if it reaches to the end of this line here, then essentially there was no error message and everything should have worked. So we're just going to say blog added, like that, and semicolon. All right. So that should have defined our add functionality. So once we test that out, that should go ahead and add that to the database for us. And I think that's all we're going to need here, guys, for this. So let's go ahead and just save this file. We're just going to do a Command S, or you can come up top and click File and Save, or you can do Control S on Windows. So the very next thing we want to do is we want to define our post class. I'm going to click on post here, and we're going to be doing something similar, but the post class is going to have a couple more methods defined, because we're going to need to do a little bit more here. So the first thing I'm going to do, let me go back to blog. I'm going to go back to blog really quickly, the blog class, because I'm going to copy these 3 lines. So we're going to copy the using system.link, and then the using Microsoft.entityframeworkcore lines, because essentially we're going to be bringing in the same references. So I'm going to go back to post, and right below the namespace here, I'm just going to paste those in like that. All right. All right, so let's go ahead and define our post. So we're going to need to do the same thing here where we define our fields, and these fields are going to be referenced in our database table. So again, we need an ID field, and so we can call it like ID, or we can call it post ID. Let's follow the same convention that we use in the blog class. We're going to say public int, and we're going to call this post ID like that, and it's going to be get set. Now one other thing I want to point out, folks, is that if you notice, I'm using the integer data type for this ID field. You can also use other types like string if you guys wanted to define some sort of UUID field. You just need to look up online exactly how to do that in .NET. There may be like NuGet packages that can help you do that, or you may be able to create your own ID logic. I would suggest finding a package to do that because it makes things a lot more concise. Okay, so we have our post ID. The next field we want here is a string, and we want to be able to store the title. So we're going to call this title and get it set. Next, we're going to want the content, and that's going to be another string, and that's going to be not context, but rather content. And that's going to be get and set as well. Okay, I'm trying to think, is there anything else? I think that's actually, do we want something else? I think what we'll need also here is the blog ID. Now, we've defined post ID. Again, post ID will be our primary key. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some comments here by using the // I'm going to say related table. Okay? And basically, we want to have a many-to-one relationship with blog. So basically, for every blog, there can be many posts, but there can only be a post can only be related to one blog, right? You can't have the same post, at least for this model. You cannot have the same post on many blogs. In a real world environment, that could be possible, but we'll just make things nice and simple here. So to define a relationship in Entity Framework, what we need to do is first define our primary key, or rather our foreign key. Sorry about that, our foreign key. So let's define our foreign key. We're going to say public integer, and we basically want to bring in that blog ID, which is defined on the blog model as we did earlier. But basically, we're going to have the same exact ID be the foreign key of this table. So we're going to say blog ID get set. And guys, the name of this must match unless you plan on overriding it. But to make things simple, this name here must match the name of our primary key in our other table. Okay. Yeah, it must match the same name. So we defined it as blog ID in our blog class, and it must match here in order for this relationship to work. And then lastly, what we need to do here, we need to also define the actual object so that way we can reference it directly. So when we query the database, we can have the option of including the related record with this post. So I'm going to say public blog because we're going to return a blog type here. And I'm going to make this nullable only because we may have a post that doesn't have a blog associated with it. So I'm just going to make this nullable. I'm going to say blog, and I'm going to say get and set like that. So basically, if we say post.blog, it's going to give us the parent record, which is the single blog site that's related to this post. Okay? All right, so I think we're done defining the various fields we'll need. Now let's go ahead and define the behavior here. So similarly to the other class, we're going to have a function or a method that returns all of the post to the user. Okay, whether we're going to use it or not, I don't know, but let's go ahead and define that. We're going to say public, and this is going to return a list of post. Okay, so list of post. We're going to call this get all as well, and I'm going to come down here and open up my curly braces here. So now we're going to define the same list. So we're going to say list post, and we're going to call this post, and set that equal to new list of post. All right. And down here, we're going to bring in that using statement again. I don't have that in my clipboard, so let's type it out. Using var DbContext, and that's going to be set equal to new blogging context. Remember, that's the name of the file that we've created, the class. It's going to be set equal to blogging context, and I'm going to open up my curly braces here. All right. Because all of the code that we'll have needs to be within this using block in order for us to work directly with the database context, okay? All right, so what we need to do here is we're gonna, again, have our try catch in the event that we have an error. So I'm just gonna create my try catch block here. And down here, I'm just gonna give it the EX variable. And let's go ahead and take care of this. So this one is for get all. So we're gonna say console.writeLine. We're going to have a $sign and the double quotes, and we're going to say error while fetching post. And we're going to have curly braces and say ex.message and semicolon. Make sure you always have your semicolons at the end, guys. If you have any errors, it could be because of that. So now, similarly to blogs, we're going to get all of our posts. We're going to say post, and that's going to be equal to DbContext, and in that we're going to have a DB set eventually called post, plural, post, and then we're going to convert that to a list by doing toList, not toLost, but toList. All right, cool. So that should end that, and then lastly here, what we want to do is we want to return post like that. So that should be our first function. All right. Cool. So yeah, that should return all of the post directly to the caller, and we should be able to get that post data. So the next thing we want to do is we're going to also have a function that will get all of the posts for a specific blog site. So let's define that right now, because now we're going to need to take in the blog ID to determine exactly which post to return. So we're going to say public, and we're going to define a list of posts again. But this time we're going to call this one get posts for. I think that's a good name, right? Yeah, we'll say get posts for, and then we're going to take in an integer of blog ID so we know which post to return, and we're going to open up our curly braces here. So for this one, we're going to do something similar. We're going to say, actually, you know what, to save some time here, let's go up here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this down here. I'm going to copy this starting from list. I'm going to copy the entire using block here like this because it's going to be rather similar to what we've done above. And I'm going to paste all of that down here. So now, again, what we're doing here is we're just instantiating a list. I'm not sure what happened to my curly braces here. Oh, it's right here. Let me just bring this on the next line. We're basically creating a list of posts because that's what we'll be returning. And in here, we have a using statement, and that's exactly where we're going to be handling our code here. All right. So let's think about this. So what we want to do here is we're saying using DbContext, and we're instantiating a new blogging context. We have our try block. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to get rid of just this line for now. And I'm going to change this down here. I'm going to say error. Let's get rid of this, just this part. Error while fetching post for blog ID. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have curly braces here. I'm going to just output the blog ID I'm passing in like that. And then in here, I'm going to say ex.message. All right, just to kind of have a different message here. All right, so what we want to do now is we're just going to have a couple of console.write lines because essentially what we need to do is just output the post information in itself. So we're going to say console.write line, and what I'll do is I'm just going to output the blog. We're just going to have one console.write line here. That's just going to be for the blog ID. I could put this outside of this function, but just to kind of show you guys that this is working from here, I'll just go ahead and add this write line here. You can choose to do it differently if you want. We're going to say here just blog ID, not blog, but blog ID, and then we're going to pass in here the blog ID, which is coming from the parameter above, and semicolon. All right. Now, next, what we want to do is we want to grab our post. So we're going to say post, and that's going to be equal to DbContext dot, and we're going to, again, have the post database set. And what we need to do is we need to now use link, because with link, we need to be able to fetch the data from the database. So here's where link, here's how link works. We're going to say from our DbContext, grab the post where, so this is kind of like a SQL statement where, we're going to say where as a function. This is a link function where P, and this is going to be our temporary variable. P stands for post here, guys. Not S, but P, where P dot, I'm not sure why my auto suggest is acting kind of wonky. So what we want to essentially say is where P dot blog ID is equal to the blog ID we're passing in. So let's try this again. P dot blog ID. And this blog ID is coming from the post object above, is equal to the blog ID I'm passing in, okay? So this is gonna basically select those records that match where the blog ID that I'm passing in is equal to the blog ID on the record itself. But that's not all. What we also wanna do, if you guys recall, we added this blog, if I scroll back up here, we added this blog reference up here as well, guys, right down here. We added this blog reference, which is a nullable type, but basically we added this here so that way we can actually get the parent record associated with this blog, with this post, which is the parent blog record. So what we need to do to fetch that, because if we were to just run this query as is, it's only going to return the post, but it won't return the blog. The blog will be null. So what we need to do is include that. So we're going to say .include, and that's another link function. And again, we're going to say P space, and then we're going to say include the blog. So P.blog. All right, so that should include the blog. And then lastly, we're going to just convert this to a list and semicolon. So this is the entire link statement we'll need to query the data from the database. And we're going to be doing other statements just like this shortly. All right. So I think that's, when I think about it, I think that's it for this. I don't think we need anything else here. All right, so let me just come down here. And what we want to do, let me just get rid of these throws. We don't need the throw here. That's if we wanted to force an exception. What we want to do is just make sure that we are outside of this using statement and we just want to return the post. So it's return post. Let's just make sure that adds up here. It can get tricky sometimes. It looks like it's good. So again, we're just returning the list of posts that we fetched from the database. All right, so that's again going to return a list of posts for a specific blog site. All right, so now let's see, what do we want to do next? Let's also write the code to get a single post. That's also very important because we want to be able to get the post detail information. So I'm going to come down here, make some new lines, and here I'm going to say public, and this one is going to return a single post. So we're just going to say post, and we're going to call this get post, singular, get post. Okay, and this is going to take in a post ID. All right, because we need to be able to get the ID so that way we can know which post record to return. Now, again, I'm not sure if this is in my clipboard. No, it's not. Okay, so we're just going to use the using again. We're going to say using. Let me think. Do I want to do? Okay, yeah, we'll go ahead and just return it within the using. So we're going to say using var DbContext. That's going to be set equal to new blogging context, like that, and curly braces. All right. So within this, again, we want to have our try catch. And guys, we're trying our best to write as much elegant code as we possibly can. Just going to say EX here. I can get rid of this system interface or system namespace since we're referencing that above. And down here, I'm going to say just console.writeLine if we have an error message, $, double quotes, error while fetching a, almost said blog, a post, because we're fetching one post. Where's my colon? There we go. And we're going to say ex.message. All right, semicolon, ex.message. All right, cool. All right, so that handles that part. So now what we want to do is, because we're getting the blog ID from the caller, essentially the UI is going to be passing this blog ID to us, we need to be able to get a single post. So to do that, I'm going to define a new variable called var post, and that's going to be equal to DbContext. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that post DB set that we'll define shortly. I'm going to say post, plural, make sure it's plural. And in here, we're going to use link again. So to get a single record, we can use the first or default. So we're going to say first with a capital F or default. And that's a function, okay? So I'll go ahead and I'll add my semicolon to the end because we'll also need to pass a lambda within this or an arrow expression. So basically this first or default method is essentially a link function that would either return the first record that matches the criteria, just a single record because we're counting on a single record since we'll be using the ID, and we know that the IDs are unique, so we're not really concerned with this method call returning more than one record. But if the first record is not found or the A record is not found, then the default value would be returned. In this case, a null value will be returned. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say here P within the parentheses, P and arrow function. And what I want to do is I want to match on the post ID I'm passing in. So I'm going to say where P is P.postID, which is our field above, is equal to, make sure it's just 2 equals, not 3, post ID. All right, and that's again the post ID that we're passing in as an argument into this method. So that should give us the single post that we need. Now, one thing we want to do is we could just return posts like this, but what if it's null? Because again, as I mentioned, this first or default can return a null if no record is found, and that could be problematic in our application. So what we need to do here is let's just go ahead and just check for null. So we're going to say if post is not equal to null, new line and arrow, or rather curly braces. If it's not equal to null, let's just return the post. Okay. Now, because we're doing the return statement within the using statement, what we should do is come down here and we should, let me just get rid of throw. You can leave throw if you want, but I'm going to get rid of it just to make things concise. What we need to do down here is we also, outside of this using statement, need to return a value, because if we get an error message, we need this method to return something, okay? So what do we want to return? We don't have access to the post variable because it's defined within the using. So to avoid a null value, I'm just going to come down here and I'm going to return a new post. It's just going to be an empty post object. Okay. Now again, I could have done new post is equal to new post up top, but this is just like another way of dealing with return statements, guys. So I just wanted to show you both ways of doing this. Okay. All right. Cool. Yeah, and it's just my word of advice to just kind of avoid returning nulls wherever applicable, because C#.NET is very unforgiving when it comes to null pointer exceptions. So it's best to just kind of instantiate a new object, and you can immediately destruct the object or deconstruct the object if you need to. But in this case, we want to return an empty object in the event that the record is not found in the database. Okay. So it looks like that's good to go, and we'll test that one shortly. What we'll do next is we'll create a method to add a new post to the database, just like we did with blog. So we're going to say public, and this does not need to return anything. So we're just going to say void here, and we're going to have another add method with a capital A. And I'm just going to come down here and open up my method brackets. And for the add method, what we're going to do is to add a post, we'll need to also have a reference to the blog that it needs to be related to. Because remember, we have the blog ID as a foreign key on this entity. So we need to be able to pass in this blog ID. So first we're going to say int blog ID to pass in the blog ID, and we'll get that from the UI. I'll show you guys exactly how. And then next we're going to pass in the actual attributes that we'll be setting. So it's going to be string of a title, which is the post title, and the context, which will be the body of the post. Not the context, but the content, rather. All right, so we're going to have those two, the title and content. All right, so again, we're going to need to have our using. So we're going to say using, again, var DbContext is going to be equal to a new blogging context, and open up the braces like this. Now I'm sure that, guys, once we get ready to run this code, I'm sure there's going to be some error messages. We're just going to fight through them together so you guys can see exactly how the debugging part works. Okay, so again, we're going to have the try block down here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to define the EX variable here, and I'm going to get rid of system. You can leave it if you wish, but I'm going to get rid of it because it's redundant to have it here and up top as well. And I'm going to get rid of throw as well. Okay. Now up in here, again, we're adding a post. So what I'm going to do is going to say console.writeLine, $, double quotes, and I'm going to pass in error here because this is the string, error while adding a post. And we're going to pass in ex.message again. Same thing, same kind of code. We already have a semicolon. Cool. All right, so within the try, again, similarly to what we've worked on before with blog, we need to be able to add a new post. So I'm going to create a new variable called new post. Like that. It's going to be set equal to a new post. Right? And I'm going to come down here and open up my brackets and then put a semicolon at the end. Okay. So first what we need to do is to establish the relationship between this table and the parent table. All we need to do is just set the ID. Okay, so we're going to say blog ID because this is with a capital B, and this is the attribute that's above, that's listed above. We're going to set that equal to the blog ID that we're passing into this method. Okay, so make sure, because the capitalization here matters, because C# is a case sensitive language, and it'll know the difference based on your casing, guys. So this blog ID here with the capital B is the property that's at the top of this class file, whereas the blog with the lowercase b is what we're passing into this method. Okay, and this is how we're actually saying that this entity is a child of the parent, which is the blog object. Okay, now we're going to come down here, we're going to say title is equal to title. And then lastly, we're going to say content with a capital C is equal to content. All right. So that should automatically add well, not all we've done so far actually is assign these values. Now we'll need to actually add them. Now, how do we add them? So what we do, I'm not sure what happened there. Let's just make sure we're within the braces. I think we're fine. Okay, so to add these, what we need to do again is we need to reference that add, which is on the post DB set property. So we're going to say DbContext, because this is coming from the blogging context file. And I'm going to show you guys in a second exactly what we're referencing. So DbContext.posts.add, and then what we're going to add is this new post, semicolon. And lastly, we need to always save the changes. So we're going to say DbContext.save changes, like that. And then we can have a console.writeLine. And we're going to say, not blog, but post added. And save. And that should be our add function there, our add method rather, there. Okay, so as you can see, we've got quite a bit of functionality when it comes to the post object. So the next thing we're going to do, again, if you recall from the demo at the start of this video, we actually have update and delete functionality. So what we're going to work on next is the update functionality. So I'm going to say public void update. Now for the update, what we need to do is pass in several arguments. In order to update, we need to know what record to update. So we're going to need the post ID. So we're going to say integer post ID. So we need to pass that in. And of course, we need to pass in the other attributes. So we're going to say string title and then string content. And I think that's all we'll need for that. And we'll just open this up. Okay. Now in here, what we'll do is we'll use the using again. So using var and DbContext, and we're going to set that equal to a new blogging context, and that's a method, and we're going to open up our curlies. Okay, and then we're going to have our try. Let's type that out again, try, and select this one. That's going to give us our try catch. We're going to pass in this EX variable here, get rid of the system namespace declaration here, and get rid of throw to make things nice and clean. And then here we're just going to say console.writeLine and $ double quotes error while, and this is updating. So error while updating a post, and pass in ex.message so we know what the actual error is. Okay? All right, so here what we want to do is we want to be able to fetch the post by its ID and then update that post record. So we're going to declare a new variable. We're going to say var post, and we're going to set that equal to DbContext dot, and we're going to again say the post DB set property, which is coming from that blogging context, and then we're going to do the first or default again, because again we need to fetch that information from the database first because we need to get the post. We're going to say P, and then arrow function P, and we're going to query by its post ID. So we're going to say P.postID is equal to post ID that we're passing in, and semicolon. So that's going to return for us the post that we would like to update. Okay. Now, in the event, again, because first or default returns a null, we need to be able to check to see if the record has been returned. So I'm just going to check to see if post is equal to null. I'm going to say if post double equal sign null. I'm just going to open up my curlies here. So if the post is null, we're going to just say console, if I spelled that correctly, console.writeLine, and here, let's just say no matching post found. So no matching post found. Okay, and that should be it for that. Okay, cool. So basically it's going to just, because we don't have to be concerned with the return, guys, in this case, because we're just doing an update. We're not going to return any information. That's the reason why we declared this method as void return type. So all we need to do is just output something to the user so the user knows that there was no match found. All right, so now what we'll do is this is going to have an else. Okay, so let's just come back up here and we're just going to type else and a new line like that. Now, if post is not null, this is where we're going to basically update the post record that we just fetched. Okay, so this is going to be rather simple. It's just going to say post dot title, and again we have access to this post because it's outside of the scope of this if statement. So we're going to say if post dot title, that's going to be equal to the title that we're passing in, and then post dot content is going to be equal to the content that we're passing in. Make sure it's the lowercase c. All right, I think that would be it for that part. And then lastly, we don't need to do like post.add because we're not adding a new post. All we need to do to update is say dbContext.saveChanges. And that should do it. And then of course we can just have a console.writeLine just to know that it was successful. And we're going to say post updated like that, and semicolon. There we go. All right, trying to just see if we need something else. Let's just clear up our white space here. Yep, I think that's good because again, we don't need to have a return type. So I think it should be fine. And again, if we get any error messages from after we build this project, we'll just come back and fix every single one. That's not a problem. All right, so lastly in this file, we're almost done with this. We need to define now a delete function. So I'm going to come down here right before the last curly brace. I'm going to type here public. And for this one, we don't need to return anything. So it's just going to be a void, public void delete. And that's going to take in, it needs to take in the entire post and not just the ID. And I'll explain why in a second. So we're going to pass the post data type with a capital P and then post as the variable name for the argument. And then we're just going to open up our curly braces. Now, the reason why we're not just going to pass the post ID here is because the entity framework requires the actual object in order to delete it from the database. Because we're going to call the .remove function or method directly on the DB set to remove the record from the database, okay? So we're going to have here our using. You guys should already be familiar with that. And we're going to say DbContext, and that's going to be equal to a new blogging context. And we're going to open up our curlies here. Now, for this, we're passing in the entire post. So this should be rather simple to knock out here. All we need to do is say dbContext.post. So we don't have to query it, guys. We can if we wanted to here, but since the post will be available to us based on the code that we'll be writing, we don't necessarily need to query the post again. So we're going to say dbContent.post, and then we're going to call .remove, and we're going to just remove the post that we're passing in, semicolon. And then lastly, again, as always, we're going to say dbContext.saveChanges, and then semicolon. And then we can just say console.writeLine, and that's going to be post deleted. All right. So the delete logic is a lot simpler than the other logic is. And one thing I just realized, guys, is that I forgot to use my try catch, and you guys hopefully caught that. So let's go ahead and add that here. Let me just make a few new lines up top here, but within the using block, make sure you're within the using block. Let's add our try catch because we want things to be consistent here. So we're going to say try, and I'm going to come down here. We're going to say EX, and here, let's get rid of system and get rid of throw. Now I'm going to say here console.writeLine $, double quotes, error while deleting, not double L, while deleting a post, and ex.message. All right. Okay. Now what I'll have to do here is I'll have to copy these lines out. So let's go ahead and cut these lines like that, cut them out, bring this up here, and then in our try area, we'll just paste them in like this and just fix our indentation, and that should be it there. So now if there's an error while deleting, it'll go ahead and catch that and handle that gracefully for us. Okay, I think that's it. That was a lot of typing. So I think that's it for this file. So let's go ahead and start moving to our blogging context, because what we'll need to do now is actually define the code that will connect with our database and use the Entity Framework Core's functionality. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna let's close everything for now. Let's close everything. And what we need to do is come over here to the left and open up our context folder. It was already expanded. I'll just open that again, and I'll double click on blogging context. Now in here, it's not going to be the biggest file, because essentially all we just need to do is just define our configurations here to make everything work. And then what we'll do shortly after is build this project, and then we'll try to run migrations. And if everything works, it's going to generate a database file for us, and then it will automatically generate the tables and fields and so on. Okay, so how do we want to do this? So the first thing I'm going to do here is we have this blogging context skeleton class. We do have to bring in a directive. So I'm going to say using, and we're going to be using Microsoft dot, and I believe it's again the Entity Framework Core. So Entity Framework Core. All right. Now, the reason why I'm not just for the record, the reason why I'm not getting auto-suggest here, which would have been very helpful, and I'm sure I may have a few mistakes in spelling, and we'll have to just go back and correct that. I'm not getting it because we haven't yet built the migrations. Once we build the migrations and the project has been completely built using the .NET build command, then all of these references should start auto-populating, and they will be underlined and then colored yellow. All right, so right now it looks like nothing. That's why I have to type everything manually. But once you get it built once, and everything should then kick in. Okay, so to get this set up to be used with Entity Framework, first what we need to do is we need to inherit from the DbContext base class that's part of our .NET framework. So to do that, what we need to do is use the colon. So we're going to say colon DbContext like this. All right, so now that we've imported, or rather inherited from this DbContext, and just what do I mean by inherited? So in object-oriented programming, we have a concept called inheritance. And basically, if you think of it sort of like a family has a mother and a father, and then the children inherit traits or characteristics from their parents. So essentially in object-oriented programming, we have this same concept where we can have a class which is again a blueprint of an object, and essentially this class can be inherited from, or can be inheritable by another class. So what I'm doing right now is I'm bringing in some of the properties and attributes and functionality from the DbContext class into this blogging context class, because we're going to be using some of those parent or base class methods within this to establish our connection to our database, and then to define our Entity Framework entities. Okay, so that's essentially what I'm doing here. All right, so let's move on here. Now, again, as you guys remember, we were using the dbcontext.post and the dbcontext.blogs attribute to add and remove records from the database. So what we need to do here is define those properties, because currently we don't have them defined. So let's go ahead and define those dbset properties right now. So first we're going to say public dbset, which is a data type in .NET that represents the database set of data that we'll be querying from the database. We're going to say blog, because that's going to be our first one. Not sure why I did that. Let me just make sure it says blog here, guys. So dbset blog. And we're going to call this blogs because that's what we referenced in our class. And then that's going to have a get and set as well. And then lastly, we're going to have a public dbset of post, or post rather. And that's going to be called posts with a plural form here. And then get and set. So just these two attributes for now is what we need here. And this is basically going to be responsible for handling the database calls that we'll need to fetch the data, because essentially what we're doing is we're fetching the data through these properties, and then If you recall, in our actual classes, we call the .toList function to convert the DB set to list. So that's essentially how that's going to work right now. So all that's left to do here is we need to define on configuration, basically our database entity. We need to be able to create our database file if it doesn't exist, and if it does exist, we just need to make modifications to the data. So to do that, within our DbContext base class here, there is a method that we need to override called onConfiguring. So I'm going to say here protected because, again, this function exists in the DbContext parent class or base class, and we need to inherit and override that functionality. So protected override, these are reserved keywords in .NET, folks. Protected override void, because it doesn't need to return anything. And we're going to override the on configuring. That's what it's called, on configuring. And then what that normally takes in is a DbContext options builder data type. Now I know that's very confusing, folks, but that's basically what it takes in. This is basically the class that's responsible, or the data type that's responsible for making modifications to the configurations that belong to this sort of context. So then what we need to do is pass in a variable or an argument. We'll call that options. It can be called anything you want it to be called. We're just going to call it options. Now I could just come down here and add curly braces, but I'm going to show you guys another way to define this, because essentially this function or method just has one line. So we don't have to do it with curly braces. What we can do instead is just make a new line here, and let's just make a tab, and we're going to use that arrow function here. And then we're going to say options, right? Options, and I believe we're going to call, because we're using the Sqlite database, we need to use a function called use Sqlite, okay, which is part of that class, because that's basically going to reference the drivers. That's why we installed those plugins earlier. And we're going to have a $sign again. Actually, we don't need the $sign because we're going to have this hard-coded here. So we're just going to use double quotes. We're going to say data source, make sure it's spelled just like this, data source is equal to, and because we want this database file to be stored in our DB folder that we created earlier, we need to specify the path. So we're going to say db/sqlite.db. Sqlite.db is the name of the file. So this is where all of our data is going to be stored. All right, and I think that should do it here. I think that should be everything, folks. So let me go ahead and save this, and let's try to build our application now. So in C# and in .NET, we have a concept of build, and when we build the solution, essentially we're just trying to build all of the references to the objects. We're trying to compile the solution into transferable code or bytecode before we run it. So essentially we'll be able to determine compile time errors here, if any exists. So I'm just going to go ahead and clear out my terminal. I'm going to come down here and type .NET build. And let's see if that builds successfully. So let's give that a second. And as you see here, we have a couple of errors to resolve. And I knew that because, again, we weren't working with autocomplete, so we're going to have a few things here. So the first one here is the modifier public is not valid for this item. Now, where does that exist? That is in our post.cs line 106. So I'm just going to come here and type Command P to open up this quick finder. And we're going to say post.cs. And we're looking for line 106. Line 106. And more than likely, it's a problem with the brackets. Okay, line 106 here. So public void. And I think that's because we defined that in the wrong place. So if you did what I did, let's make sure we make this change here. So from line 106, or whatever line yours starts on, I believe there's a problem with our brackets somewhere. All right, so I figured out what the problem was, guys. So only make this following change if you guys experience an error when doing the .NET build command. So basically, what the mistake I made is I defined a method within a method. I defined the update method within the prior method up here. So what we need to do is from line 106, for you it may be a slightly different depending on your spacing here, but what we need to do is we need to cut this method out and then just kind of paste it on the outside of this other method. So let me just start from line 106, the very top of the update function. I'm just going to highlight everything here, going all the way down. And I think it's going to go down to about line, yeah, down to line 131 here. Let's just get that closing brace. And I'm going to cut that out by doing a Command X or Control X on Windows. I'm going to bring this up here, get rid of the extra spacing. Then I'll come down to line 107 and I'll paste that function in. And now we need to fix some of the indentation. So what we need to do is we need to highlight everything. I'm just going to hold Shift and press the up arrow to highlight everything going up. Just highlight everything. And except line 107, except the actual method signature. So I'm highlighting basically everything starting with the first curly brace here. I'm going to hold the Shift key and I'm going to press the Tab key to move back one indentation. And I think that should be fine now, guys. I think this should be aligned, okay? Because if you look up here, we have the ending curly brace here. If I go down here, we have the ending curly brace there. So I think that should be fine. I'm going to go ahead and save that, and let's run build again. So .NET build. Let's see if we have any other error messages. So let's give that a second to build. And it looks like we have one more error message here. So let's see what this says. So within the post line 148, and I'm basically debugging this, guys. Actually, it's line 48, not 148. So basically right here, it's saying, let's go up to line 48. Line 48, okay. So it doesn't recognize the P variable here. Okay, that's because we mistyped this. We forgot our opening braces here, our opening parentheses. Because you can see right here, where's the line 148? Yeah, right here, we're forgetting it on line 48, rather. We're forgetting this opening parentheses. So let's just add that in like that. And now that should be fine. So I'm going to come down here. Let's go ahead and clear the terminal. And let's press the up key twice and hit enter for .NET build. And this is still another error message. That's interesting. So now it's saying it's expecting a closing parentheses. Did we forget that? Let's say on line number 50 this time. So, okay, let's just kind of look through this here again. So we have opening parentheses, closing, opening parentheses, closing. Huh, that's awkward. So on line number 50, okay, opening, closing. All right, let's read through this link statement because it's not liking something within this link statement. So let's start with line number 47. So we have post is equal to DbContext post, or rather .post .where. We have the opening parentheses. I think I know what a problem is. So right here, guys, you see we have like post, and then we have the P. Let's get rid of this. If you guys made this mistake, this should only say opening parentheses P and then arrow function. Okay, or arrow reference. So I think that should solve the problem now. Okay, let's try this again. We're going to clear the console, up arrow twice, and hit enter to build this solution. And now it looks like that was successful. Okay, but it's giving us a warning. We can ignore that for now. Let's just go ahead and get everything else done. So I'm going to clear the console again. So the first thing we're going to do now is, now that we've defined our models and we've defined our blogging context object or class, we can go ahead and run migrations. Now, what are migrations? Essentially, since we've already built our post and blog, for example, if I go to post, you see up here we've defined our properties, which are going to be our database table fields or attributes. So basically, when we run the migrations commands, it's going to generate these fields for us. Okay, it'll essentially be empty database tables, right, with these fields included. So once we run these migrations, what we'll do is going to automatically generate some files within a migrations folder of our solution. And in those files will be essentially snapshots of the database, the construction and the schema of the database at any given point of our application development cycle. All right, so let me show you guys how this works. I'm going to come down here. I believe the command is .net, and this is going to make the migrations files to prep us to write these to the database. So we're going to say .net-ef space migrations space add, and then we need to give this a name. We're just going to call this first migration. You can call it whatever you want. It just needs to have a name so that way it can differentiate itself and be unique between migration files so that there are no collisions. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter and give that a little bit of time. So the build started. So it's basically going to run that .NET build again for us. And now it says build succeeded. And that's going to go ahead and generate that migrations folder. And as you can see here on the left, it generated that for us right here. So if I expand that folder, I'll just open one of these files, for example. You'll see here that we have some code. And this code was not written by us, but rather was automatically generated. The class is the name that we gave the migrations file. And then this class inherits from a migration base class. And essentially within this class is setting up the schema for the database for us. The columns that are, or fields that this database table would hold, and other configurations. So you guys could take some time and read through this if you want. I'm not necessarily concerned with this. I want to see the bad boy generated. So I definitely want to see the database be generated. So the next command that we're going to run is the command to update the database. In this case, because we don't have a database file, it will automatically create the database and update it with the rather the fields that we've created. So the command is .net-ef database update. All right, and now I'm going to hit enter. And what that should do for us is it should automatically add, because if I go back to our blogging context file, just to show you guys something, if I go back here, this is the last file we configured here to work with Entity Framework, and basically we specified that we want this file to be in the DB folder, and we want the file to be called sqlite.db, right? It must end in a DB extension so that it gets picked up as being a database. So now it looks like it's compiled, and now if I expand our DB file here, or folder here, you guys will see we have 3 new files here, or rather for now we have 1 file, which is our SQLite DB. We'll eventually have 3 files, and I'll show you guys when that will happen exactly. But if I open this file up, now you'll see that there are 2 other files generated because we're using the viewer extension. And basically this is how that viewer works. It automatically opens up a GUI for us so we can view our database tables as if they're Excel spreadsheets. So it basically has a cell and column format. And in here, we see that we have the various fields defined on the post table, because currently it's doing a query, select all from post. And basically we have our fields or columns defined, our post ID column, and then we have our content and our title columns. And basically this is a SQL statement that is querying to see if there are any records in this table. Now currently we don't have any data here. That's the reason why we don't see records, but essentially if we had data here, you would see various rows underneath this. You'll see 1, 2, 3, and so on. Alternatively, we can actually select another table. So we can select the blogs table, for example, and it's going to show us the schema for the blogs table. So this is how we use the SQLite viewer extension for Visual Studio Code. Now what we need to do, guys, is we need to actually start working with some of the UI. So to get cracking on the UI, what I'm going to do first is, for now, I'm going to close out all of these tabs like this. Now I'm going to go back to our folder here, and essentially, let me just collapse this folder here. And what we need to do is we need to open up our program.cs file, because if you guys recall at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that program.cs will be the entry point for our application, because when we define a main method within our C#.NET application, essentially we're defining the starting point of our application, okay? This is the very first line of code that gets executed by .NET, specifically the customized code that we write will be first executed here. All right, so what we'll do is currently we have a console.writeLine function being called here. I'm just going to get rid of that because we don't need this, because we're going to create our own custom code that will call our database and carry out certain interactions based on the user input. So the first thing I'll do here on line number 1 is I will bring in our system namespace using system like that. And then I'm going to bring in our namespace, the blog, rather is called efcrash. I believe it's called efcrash. And just to double check that, let me just open up one of our other files here. Let's say blog.cs. It actually is efcrash with an underscore. So I'm just going to copy this name. I'm going to go back to program.cs, and I'm just going to replace that with this. And now the reason why we need to say using and not namespace here is because we need to use the model files. We need to get access to those files, and the only way we can get access to those fields and methods is if we define here using ef_crash, because this is the namespace in which the models are located. Okay, so now let's go ahead and define a class, because essentially we're going to need to have a program class. We're going to say class program. We'll open up our set of curly braces here, and now this class needs to have a main method, and again, that's going to be the starting point of our application. So the main method must be static. So we can say static void main, and we don't need any arguments here. Normally, sometimes you'll see developers pass in string, array, and args. We don't need that here because it should still work without that, and we don't need access to those arguments, which are usually part of the request. We don't need access to that. All right, so what do I want this main method to do? Again, when we run the application, when we type the .NET run command, this is the very first method that gets executed. So what we're going to do is we're going to define our UI, okay? So there's going to be a few functions that I'll define in this class or in this file in general that we're going to be calling, which will then subsequently call the data access layer that we've defined, okay? So first I'm going to define a new integer variable, and we're going to call that choice, because we want to be able to store the choice that the user makes, and I'm going to set that to a default of 0. Because we won't have a choice called 0, this is safe to do because the choices will be 1 through 6. We'll have 6 different options, and basically it will be numeric input, so that's the reason why we're going to be storing that as an integer. Okay. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to use a loop, because essentially we want all of our code to be within a do-while loop. And the reason why we want that is we want this UI to repeat based on whether the user would like to continue using the application or exit out. So I'm going to say here do, and I'm going to bring in my do-while loop here, like this. And within this do-while loop, we need to define a condition, because what is a do-while loop? Just in a high level, any code that we write between these curly braces for this do-while loop will be executed at least once. Okay, that's why we're calling it a do-while loop. If we use a regular while loop, there is no guarantee that the code would execute. So if we want it to run at least once, we need to use a do-while loop in this case, and we need to define a condition. So currently, it's asking us to run this as long as the condition is true, but we don't want to do that because otherwise it would be infinite. Let's remove the true keyword from here, and what we want to do is we want to eventually define a function called hasQuit. So I'm going to say while the user has not quit. So we're going to use an exclamation mark and say has quit, because this is going to be a method that we're going to call below. And we can go ahead and call that method, or rather define that method right now. So within our class, let's go ahead and define a static method called hasQuit. We're going to say public static, and we're going to return a Boolean value because we need to use that as our condition. Public static bool has quit, like that, and it's not going to take in any arguments, as you can see above. Okay, now within this has quit method, what we want to do is we want to check if the user has typed yes or no, or y or n, to either continue using the application or exit the application respectively. Okay, So first one I'm going to do is I'm going to define a new Boolean variable. I'm going to set that to is valid. I'm going to set that, or rather we can call it is valid input, and we're going to set that to false by default. Then I'm going to have another Boolean. I'm going to call that has quit, and we're going to set that to false as well. All right. Now what we want to do is we're going to have another do while loop here, because what we essentially want to do in this do while loop is we want to determine if the user has entered valid input. That's the reason why we have this separate Boolean up top. We want to determine if the user has entered valid input or not. So let's see, what's the best way for us to do this? I think what we can do, and I'm just kind of thinking on the fly here, guys. What we can do here first is we can come down here and define our while condition. All right, so let's go down here. Let's remove this true. And basically what we want to do here is we want to say, while this condition is not true. So we want to say while the user has not entered valid input. And the valid input would either be yes or no. So if the user enters in like a number, for example, then that would not be valid input. So we want to check for that so that way we can have the desired results. So it'll stay within this loop until the input is valid, in other words. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. All right, so now we're checking for that. Now we're going to have quite a bit of code here, guys, because we need to then also output a few things to the screen. We're going to need some input from the user. So this is where we're going to get a bit into the UI part here. Okay, so the first is we're going to do a console.writeLine. And in this first console.writeLine, we're going to say, would you like to continue? Because again, this is going to get outputted. Let's say, for example, we've already run some sort of database operation, return data to the user. After that happens, we're going to ask the user this, all right? Because we want to know if this user wants to continue, okay? So now we're outputting this to the user. So now we're expecting input from the user. So to get input from the user, we need to define a string variable. But before we do that, let's just add another line. Let me just add another write line here to give some more clarity. We're going to say press Y. Let's say press Y to continue, press N to exit. So that is nice and clear. So now let's take in input from the user. We're going to say string, because it's going to be a string data type from the console. String user input. So this is what the user is typing into us. And we're going to set that equal to console.readLine, like that. Now, let me just put a semicolon here for now to explain what this does. So this console.readLine is exactly how we read the user's input from a console application. All right, so this is whatever the user types in. Once they hit enter, this console.readLine will return that value and store it in user input. However, what if the user just hits enter? Well, if the user just hits enter, it can return a null value. So what we need to do is that if the value is null, we don't want to store the user input as null. Instead, we want to store that as an empty string. So right before the semicolon, I'm just going to make another space. I'm going to use the double question mark operator. Okay, and then I'm going to set that to an empty string like this. Alternatively, you can also do string.empty if you want, whatever floats your boat. In this case, I'm going to do double quotes here for an empty string. That way, the string will be empty and not null, so we won't run into any kind of null pointer exceptions. All right, so that should get the user's input. Now, what we want to do next is we want to basically convert this, and this is part of the reason why we're setting an empty string, is we want to make this a lowercase input, because what happens, for example, if the user types in a y, or like a lowercase y or an uppercase y, we want those to be equal, even though we are kind of saying up top uppercase y, just to kind of make it more user friendly. We just want the user to type y or n regardless of casing. So we're going to say user input is equal to user input dot to lower, like that, and then close that out like that. And that will make it lowercase, so that way we can match on the character itself, not necessarily on the character and the casing. All right, now we need to check for the value. So we're going to say if, we're going to use an if statement, if user input dot equals, if that equals, I'm not sure what happened there. Let's go back. Let's see, something happened. Equals, here we go. So if this user input equals y, because again, we made it lowercase so I can match on this. If that equals y, then we're going to do something. Now, before I move forward, let me explain this. Now, there are two ways to check for equality. You can check for equality using the dot equals, or you can check for equality using a double equals. There may be some preferences of one over the other, but generally it's better to use the dot equals if you can. And the reason why is because it actually checks for the actual value, whereas the other one in C# world checks for the value, but also considers the location of that value in memory. So you definitely want to use the dot equals wherever applicable instead, okay? So we're going to say if the user input dot equals y, we're going to say is valid input. We basically want to set the is valid input to true, because this is one of the inputs that we're looking for here, okay? So that's the first condition. Now we're going to say else if, and we're going to define here if the user input dot equals, again, if this equals n, and again, we're not using single quotes, even though this is just one character because this is a string, okay? Just to point that out as well. So I'm going to open up a set of curly braces here. Now this is also valid input, so we need to handle it as such, okay? So if the only reason why let me just kind of back up here, going back to the yes functionality here. Well, all we need to do is set the is valid input to true. We don't need to do anything else because we want the user to continue. So essentially what the program's going to do is going to cycle back to the very beginning. We're not going to exit it at all. But in this case, we're going to exit the program. Let me just come up here and just add some comments and say continue. All right, so this is going to exit the program right here. All right, so to exit the program, let's have a couple of outputs here. We're going to say console.writeLine, and we're going to say thank you for using Blog Manager, like that. All right, because that's the name of our app. And now to actually exit the console, how do we do that? Well, within the environment namespace in .NET, we have an exit method, and all we have to do is pass it a 0 to exit. So we're going to say environment.exit exit 0. All right. So that should automatically exit the namespace. So now we're going to say is valid input, and we're going to set that to true as well because it is valid. Okay, n is one of the valid choices. However, we're also going to come down here. We're going to say has quit is equal to true as well. Because remember, this has quit is what pretty much governs whether we continue going or not. Okay. All right. And then there's just one more else. So we're just going to add an else because if it's not y or n, we need to define an else here. So what we want to do is if we don't have y or n, we just want to output something to the user that this input was invalid. So we're going to say console.write, let's say console.writeLine, invalid input, try again, like that. All right. Lastly, what will happen is if we, whether we have a valid input or not, we're going to exit this while loop, this do while loop rather. And what we need to do next is we need to return the has quit variable. So we're going to say return has quit and make sure that this return is outside of the while loop, guys. Otherwise, you're going to run into some issues there. All right. So that's basically our first method, our has quit method here. So let me just go back up top to our has quit call, which is right here. Okay, so now we're back up here in our main method. So that basically is going to handle and govern the flow of our application, whether we continue running the application or not. So now what we need to do is let's start defining a little bit of how this is going to work. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to have a couple of UI inputs and outputs. And basically, we're just going to be taking in the data from the user and then carrying out a series of actions based on what the user is entering. Okay, so let's see. I think the best thing we can do is let's start working with our do while loop. And what I'm going to do throughout this is I'm going to create some random method declarations or method calls, and then we'll actually go down below and create the method one by one. Okay, each method. So the first thing we want to do is we want to show an intro. So when we saw that in the demo earlier, we actually had a list of 6 options. So we want to show that list when the user starts the application. So I'm just going to create a function or method called show intro. And this is currently not defined. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to come down here and define that down here somewhere. So we're going to have our show intro. And let's just make sure it's right before the closing curly braces. So we're going to say, we can say private. Actually, a lot of these functions could be private. So I'm going to change the one above. So we'll say private static. And this is going to be a void because it doesn't need to return anything. Private static void show intro. And it doesn't take in any arguments. So we just open it like that. Now, before I move on, let me just come back up to this method, to our has quit method. And it doesn't need to be public. It can be private. And the reason why we can use a private access modifier here is we don't need this code to be called by any other class or file. Okay? So I'm just going to change this to private. It doesn't need to be public. You can leave it as public if you wish, but I'm going to change that to private. Okay? So now what we need to do is define our show intro method. So let's go back to that. And I typically like to use Command F and type in the name to kind of quickly jump between, because this file can become pretty hefty soon. All right, so the very first thing we want to do is when the user types in .NET run, the first thing we want to do is we want to clear the console of any existing output. So we're going to use the console.clear function. All right, and that's going to clear, that's basically like running the clear command within the console. Next, what we want to do is we want to just output a welcome message. So we're going to say console dot, let's say write line. And what could we say? We could say welcome to the blog manager. What would you like to do? All right. All right. So now we have that line that's going to be outputted. Now we're going to output another line. Now let's go ahead and output our menu options. Okay, so we're going to say console.writeLine. And actually what we can do is, let's do this. Let's make it nice and clean. What we'll do is we're going to use, let's go back up here to this line, the what would you like to do. Let me just change that. What would you like to do? I was missing my D there. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to, at the very end of the string, add a \n character. That's for a new line. So essentially, this console.writeLine already has a /n at the end. But I'm going to add another one here. You know, alternatively, I could do another console.writeLine without any output. Let's say if I wanted to do this, it will be the same thing as using the \n, but I'm not going to do that because I want things to be a lot cleaner. So I'm going to use a \n so I can make another new line. So after this output here, there will be 2 new lines. So that means that there will be 1 blank new line after this output. All right, if that makes sense to you folks. All right, so now that we have that, we're going to have another console.writeLine, and let's start making our menu. So option number 1 will be add a blog site, semicolon. I'm just going to copy this. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we'll have 6 options total. So for option number 2, let's see. So for option number 2, let's call this get all blogs, right? Because that's going to call the get all function. For option number 3, not sure what's going on there. Okay, so for option number 3, add a post. For option number 4, get, oops, let me change the number here, 4, get all post, right? Now, obviously, the get all post, once we actually create this logic, is going to be for the getting all posts for a particular blog. Option number 5 will be update a post, and then option number 6, which is the final option, will be delete a post. All right, and I'll go ahead and save that. And we have our semicolons at the end. Everything looks gravy. All right, so now what we need to do here is we need to have another output here. So I'm going to come down here after the last option, and I'm going to say console.writeLine select an option, or let's just say select a number so it's clear. Select a number, okay, like that. All right, so all this code is going to do is just going to show the display. Okay, we don't want to take any input within this code. Okay, so that's pretty much that method here. Let's just scroll back up here to our main method, and let's just make sure everything looks good here. So far so good. We're just basically going to call the show intro method. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to start working a little bit with some of the logic here, because so far we just have the UI piece, part of the UI at least. So I'm going to make some new lines here. I'm going to say we need to be able to first take in a Boolean value, which will be the choice that the user makes. Because again, we're outputting the menu at this stage. So we're going to say bool is valid choice. We're going to set that equal to, basically, what we need to do here is we need to convert a string into a Boolean using the try parse. Let me just type this out. I'm going to explain this to you guys. I'm going to say int.try parse. There's a function or method in C# called try parse. I'll explain what that is shortly. In here, the first argument we'll pass is console.readLine to get the input from the user. And then we're going to say comma, and then the second will be an output, and we're going to pass in here the choice variable that we defined above, the integer variable. So now what is this doing? So essentially, if you guys recall, I mentioned that the console.readLine returns a string, so text. So it's basically the user's input, okay? So once that console read line returns text, we're passing that as the value to this try parse method. The try parse is almost like a try catch block, but what it will do is it will try to fetch the information out, the data out from the console.readLine. And if there is an error, then it's going to return a false to this variable here, this is valid choice, as a Boolean. If there is not an error, then it's going to return a true and is going to assign that value to choice. So in any circumstance, choice will have a value. The difference will be really the Boolean here. And the reason why we're doing this is if we don't do this, we may run into an issue where a user may enter, for example, a letter instead of a number, because we're expecting numeric input here. So if the user enters in it like a letter, then that may be incorrect input, and then your application may have undesired results or undesired behavior. So we want to make sure we handle this situation very carefully. All right, so now we've got that, whether that true or false value, and now we should also have the choice value as well. So I'm just going to output here another write line just to kind of give it a new line break. Because what we want to do is we want to just have some space between the outputs here. So now what we need to do is we need to check if we have a valid choice or not. So first I'm going to say if the choice is invalid. So if not, which is the exclamation mark, is valid choice. And basically, if we do not have a valid choice, all we want to do is ask the user to try again. So we're going to say console.writeLine. And here we can say invalid choice, try again. Okay, so that's going to handle the scenario based on that being false, right? So if is valid choice is false, that's why we're using this exclamation mark. It'll automatically output this message for us. Now, we also need to have an else condition. So we're going to come down here and say else and open up these curly braces. Now, if we do have a valid choice, what we want to do is run the selections. Okay, we want to run whatever choice they made. So we're going to have another method. We're going to call this run selection, and we're going to pass in our choice, which is currently an integer. All right, so currently we do not have this defined, but essentially that's all our main method is going to be, guys. It's just going to be that. So now what we have to do is we have to go down here and define our run selection method. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's go down here, and again, this could be a private method as well. I'm going to come down here, and right before the closing curly brace of this class, I'm going to say private static, and it doesn't need to return anything, so we're going to say void, and we're going to say run selection, and it's going to pass in the integer of choice as we saw above, and just open that up like this. Okay, so the very first thing that we want to do here is we want to just kind of confirm what the user has chosen. So we're going to say console.writeLine, and we're going to say use selected. Actually, you know what? Let's make this kind of like an interpolation. We're going to say $, and in double quotes, you selected, colon, and then curly braces, and we're going to pass in choice. I'll show what's going on there. Choice, like that. Now, I'm not sure, guys, why I'm not getting auto suggest, so what I'm going to do right now is let me pause the video, and I'll come right back, and because I need to just reopen my Visual Studio Code. I'll be back in a sec. All right, guys, I'm back, and now that I restarted my Visual Studio Code, you guys will notice that certain things are being highlighted now. So it looks like it kicked in some of the auto suggest. We'll see shortly. If it doesn't, we'll just type it all out. Sometimes it's a bit wonky because, again, this C# dev kit is still rather new, so there still may be some issues when it comes to like highlighting and you know, auto suggest and things like that. Okay, good. So we left off here where we are outputting the choice that the user made. So the next thing we need to do is we need to check for each and every condition here within this method, because based on the user's choice, we're going to carry out a certain set of instructions. So I'm going to come down here and make some new lines. And instead of using like multiple if statements, because we have 6 different options, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a switch case statement. And it works like this: switch. I'm not getting auto suggest. There it is. All right. So if I hit enter here, you guys will see that it automatically outputted for me a default case. Now we're going to be adding our own cases one by one, which essentially are like if statements. So it's almost like an if and else if trail. Let me show you guys how this works for the newbies out there. So in the switch statement, the first thing we need to do between these parentheses is we need to pass in the value that we'll be checking against. So the value is going to be the choice, which is the integer value. Secondly, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come down here to default, and I'm just going to define my default case here. So basically, if none of the aforementioned, or rather none of the conditions that we'll create are met, then we need to default to a certain behavior. So let's imagine if the user enters in like 7, or if the user enters in 100, whatever. You know that we have 1 through 6 as options. So if the user does not select one of those, then basically we're going to output something to the console. We're going to output here console.writeLine. And let's see, what do we want to output? Let's output please select a choice between 1 to 6, like that. Please select the choice between 1 to 6. Cool. And then lastly, we need to break out of this. So we'll just add a break keyword, which is going to exit this switch case. Okay. Awesome. Now, normally you don't need the break there, but I just like to put it there just in case, you know, just to keep things consistent. You don't need it there because this is the last, you know, sort of leg of this switch case. Okay, let's come back up here, and above the default, we need to now define our cases. So the first case I'm going to say is case 1, colon, and I'm going to come down here, I'm going to type in break again, and semicolon, and I'm going to copy these 2 lines 5 more times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So now let's come back up here, and we're going to say the second one is case 2, then case 3, then case 4, then case 5, and lastly case 6. Now, if you guys are wondering why am I naming it this essentially this value here is the choice value because it's an integer. That's why we're saying case 1 through 6. If we were passing in choice as a string, then we would have to use this. Or if, like, for example, if the choice was equal to like 1, the number, the word 1, you would type it like this, right? But in this case, we're using integer values, so we have to just use an integer data type here. All right. So if you guys recall case number 1, let me just scroll back down here let's kind of skip quickly through this. Let's go to show, I think it was called show intro. Geez, where is it? Show, yeah, show intro right here. So here are our, you know what I'll do is let me just go ahead for now. I'm just gonna copy these lines here so we don't have to keep scrolling back down. What's going on? Here we go. Let's copy that and let's go back to our run selection. And what I'm going to do is right above the switch, I'm going to paste these in. So what I want to do is I want to comment these out. All right, like that. And the reason why is I don't want to have to keep scrolling back down to see what I'm working on at the moment. So the very first one, as you see here above, is we need to add a blog site, okay? So what we need to do is we need to define the behavior as part of case 1 to define a new blog site. Now to do this, I can do this many ways. I can write my code in here, but I can tell you right now that this will get very hefty and very hard to manage over time. So the preferred option is to create a separate class whose sole responsibility is to handle the CRUD operations or the database operations for this application. So let me go ahead and go down here. I'm going to clear out our console. And what I'm going to do is define a brand new class, but I'm going to put this in our project root directory. So that class is going to be called data manager. So I'm going to type here .NET new class, and we're going to say -n as a parameter, and we're going to say data manager, capital D, capital M. We're not going to specify -o because, again, we want this to be stored in our project root directory. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And as you guys can see over here now, we have our data manager class right here. So let's go ahead and open that up. And right now, again, we have boilerplate code, right? So in this class, what we'll need to do is define the various methods that would call our models, essentially. So we're basically separating our concerns by defining a separate data management class. And you can kind of think of this as being sort of like our business logic layer, because it's going to be the liaison between the UI layer, which is our program.cs file, and our models, which is our data access layer portion, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing I'm going to do here is we have our skeleton. Let's see, what do we need to do here? The first thing we're going to do is we're referencing our namespace, and we're going to have our data manager. I think what we'll do is let's instantiate both the blog and the post objects here first. And we can make these private because no other class needs to access these directly. So we're going to say private static, because this needs to be static, and I'll tell you why in a second. Private static blog, and then we're going to say underscore blog instance, we'll just say blog instance is equal to a new blog to instantiate the object, okay? Now, let me just kind of backtrack and explain what's going on here. So I didn't really explain what static meant. So static means we'll only need to run this once and it'll stay in memory. So the important thing to remember in .NET is that when you define a function as static or a method as static, that any method call that's being referenced within that method should be defined as static as well. Non-static methods cannot be called within a static context directly like that. So I'm just going to instantiate these as, or set these rather, as static properties within this class, because essentially all of the database calls will be in here. It won't be directly in our UI. So the second one I'll define here is private static, and we're going to say post here, and that's going to be the variable name of underscore post instance. I'm going to set that to new post. So now we'll have our two static, our static objects here being referenced, and we're basically instantiating at once and keeping that in memory. And here's the reason why I'm doing that. I'm going to define static methods below, and we're going to use these variables above to then make our method calls to our models. Okay, so we're going to say as the first one, public static. It has to be static so that our UI can reference it statically. Void, because we're not going to instantiate an object here. We're just going to say data manager dot and whatever the function name is. So public static void add blog site, and that does not need to take in any parameters. Okay, I'm missing a D. For some reason, my D key malfunctions sometimes. I definitely know how to spell add, guys, so don't worry about that. But I know how to spell add. All right, so the first thing we want to do here is let's just do some output. So we say console.writeLine, and I think I want to output here. I want to output something saying like enter blog website name. So enter blog website name. All right, because again, when the user types 1 as the selection, this is going to be the UI component that's going to get outputted, or the UI piece, but then below that we'll have the business logic here as well to call the data access layer. Okay, so when the user enters in the website name, we'll need to capture that input. So we're going to say string name, and that's going to be equal to console.readLine. Now again, here we don't need try parse because we're dealing directly with a string. Console.readLine. But in this case, as I mentioned before, it could return a null, so we'll need our double question mark and then an empty string. And now that error goes away, as you saw. Basically, that squiggly line that was underneath is letting us know that it could return null. Okay. Actually, right below this, what I'll do is now I'll call my method that I need. So again, what we need to do, let's go back to the blog class really quickly. I'm just going to open up blog.cs here on the side. And this is asking us to add a blog site. So we're just going to go to our add function here, our method. And this add method takes in a name and a URL, rather. So what we need to do is we need to call this. And if you notice, it's not marked as static. So that means we have to instantiate the object to call this, right? We can't just say blog as the class dot add. So let me go back to our data manager class. And if you saw above, we already instantiated this blog object up top here, okay, with this static declaration. So what we can do down here is now we can say underscore blog instance dot add, which is the add function that's in the blog class. And now we need to pass it the arguments. So the first argument that we need to pass is the name. Or rather, not the name, the name. And then the second one is the URL. All right, and that should be that piece. Just kind of checking here. I think that should do it for that. I think that should be it for that method, guys. Now that I think about it, let me just scroll down here. I want to make sure my curly braces are correct. Okay, we can get rid of this little space right here. Like that. Okay. All right. I think that should be it. So again, the responsibility of this class is not necessarily to do the database work in itself, because our models class is doing that. Basically, what the responsibility of this class is to be sort of the link between the UI and the database, kind of like a controller, if you will. It's not necessarily a controller, but it acts almost as if it's a controller. All right, so that should be the add functionality. Next, what we want to do is we want to handle the scenario of, I believe it's selection number 2, getting all blogs. So we're going to come here right before the last curly braces, and we're going to say again public static, and we're going to say void get all blogs. All right. And for this one, what we want to do is we want to call that get all method that's in our blog class. So we're going to say var blogs. Here we're using the var keyword again, and that's going to be equal to underscore blog instance dot get all semicolon. Okay. Now this method actually, this method we're going to have to do a check here. Basically, we need to check if we're getting some blogs back from the database, and the reason why is we want to output no blogs found or something of the sort if there are no blogs returned. So I'm going to say here if blog, or blogs rather, and to check if there are any records within this list, we can say .count, because essentially we're returning an iterable object or enumerable object to this blogs variable. So we can say blogs.count with a capital C. If blogs.count, you know what, let's check if it's equal to 0. So if it's empty. Now there is another, I'm not sure if this is going to work. Let me see. No, actually, let's use the count. If it's equal to 0, let's just stick with this for now. We're just going to console.write line no blogs found semicolon. All right. Now we'll have our else condition. And in our else condition, what we want to do is we want to loop through each and every blog and output the data of that blog, right? We basically want to output its ID, its name, and its URL. Okay, so we'll have some UI portion here. And we could do this in our view, to be honest, but again, we have one method being called, and we want to avoid having all that code in our case statements, right? We don't really want to have it there. So let's just do it in here so it's nice and easy to change if we need to. All right, guys, so before I continue, there's one thing we'll need to change here. So we need to scroll back up here, and in our method at the top, our add blog site method, I actually jumped the gun and I forgot to add the input and output for the URL. So let's do that right now. I'm just going to make a few new lines above this blog instance line. I'm going to first do a console.write line, and we're going to output here enter URL colon like that. And now what we need to do is we just need to capture that that input. So we're going to say string URL. We're going to set that equal to console.readline, and then we're going to use a double question marks and then the empty string. All right, so now that should store the URL in this variable, and we'll be passing both the name and the URL parameters to this add method to add the record to the database. So that should be it for that method above. Now let's go back down here to our get all method. So now we were working here on our else statement here, and basically in this else block, we need to loop through each and every blog record and then output the blog information here to the user so that the user can see the information. So what we're going to do is we're going to construct a for each loop to do this. So we're going to say here for each var item in blogs, because we want to loop through all of the blogs in that list. And within this, we're going to say console.writeLine. And first, we're going to output the blog ID. So we're going to use the $ in double quotes and say blog ID. And then curly braces, we're going to set that equal to item.blog ID. Okay, so again, item in this case will be the blog record. Okay, so that's going to be the first, the blog ID. The second thing we're going to output here will be the name. So we're going to say console.writeLine. I'm not sure what happened there. Console.writeLine, like that. $ on the outside here, and in here we're going to say blog name. And we're going to use curly braces here, and we're going to say item.name with a capital N. And then lastly, we want to output the URL. So we're going to say console.writeLine and then $, double quotes, and then we're going to say, let's just say URL, and then curly braces item.url with a capital U. Okay. All right. So that should be the information that we'll need here to output. So lastly, let's see. I think all we need to do now, actually, we don't need to do anything else here because again, all we're going to be doing is we're going to be outputting this information to the user to get all the blogs. Okay. So we don't necessarily have to call any data layer method outside of what we're calling above. Okay, so that's all this function will do. It will just display all the blogs that's related, or rather all of the blogs that's available to us in the database. All right, just thinking here. Okay, cool. So we've got our first two methods defined. The next method I want to create below here is I want to have the add post method because again, we already have the add blog site method above. So now I want to add a post to the database. Now we've already constructed our data access layer code. We've defined our add function or method within the post class. So we need to call that method within this data manager class. So let's go ahead and define a new method. We're going to say public static void because we don't want to return anything. We're going to say add post and open up the new brackets here on the next line. And then we're going to, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to output the post title, or rather we're going to ask the user for the post title. Sorry about that. So we're going to say console.writeLine, and we're going to say enter post title. So we're essentially just asking the user to enter the title as we've been doing with other console.writeLines. Now, obviously, we need to capture this, and this is going to be a string. So we're going to say string title is equal to console.readLine, and we need to use a double question mark and then empty string again to set that as the default. Cool. So that should give us the title from the console. Next, we want to be able to grab the content or the body. So we're going to say console.writeLine again. As you can see, we're using this quite often. And we're going to say here, enter post content because we want the user to enter the body of the content here. Okay, so what the actual blog content will be. And then we're going to say here down below, we're going to capture that input and say string content. We're going to set that equal to console.readLine. And again, the same thing, like that. All right, so that should grab the title and the content. So the next thing we want to do here is we want to display the available blogs. And the reason why we want to do that is we want to be able to allow the user to assign this post to a specific blog. Because again, we have a many-to-one relationship between post and blog. So one blog can have many posts. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to ask the user to specify the blog ID, which is going to be the parent records ID, to associate with this specific post so that we'll have that relationship stored within the database. So first to do that, we're going to just kind of do a console.writeLine, and we'll just say here available blogs, blogs like that. And this is going to be a list of available blogs. Now what we could do is we can once again do the for each loop if we wanted to and loop through each blog. But we've already done that above. So the quickest way to do this is we can actually reuse the same get all blogs method above that we have here. We have this get all blogs method that we're using to retrieve a list of all the blogs from the database. So we can reuse that method again so that we can get all the blogs and just output the what we need to output. So we're just going to call get all blogs here. And that's all we have to do. We don't have to store anything because nothing is returned because it's a voided method. Okay. What that's all that's going to do is just going to output the current blogs that's in the database. And that's going to allow the user to select a blog by its ID to associate with this post. So now let's just give some further instructions here. I'm going to say console.writeLine, and I'm going to say here select. Let's say select the blog you want to add this post to. Okay. And so now what will happen is when we're asking the user that, we would want to capture that, and that data will be an integer. So we need to be able to handle that accordingly. So to do that, we've done this before, but let's do it here as well. The first thing we need to do to ensure that we'll have that data is to capture it. So first we're going to define a new integer variable. We're going to say int, and we're going to call this one blog ID because this is the data that the user is going to give us. So int blog ID is equal to 0. We did this before in one of the other classes. Okay. Let me see what's going on here. It's giving me a squiggly line. That's probably because I haven't used it yet. Let's move on and we'll figure it out later. Okay, so we'll assign blog ID as 0. And now what we need to do is we need to use that try parse method again to check to see if the actual value is numeric, and then we need to store the value in the blog ID variable. So basically that try parse method that we'll call will return a Boolean. If it's true, that means that the value is valid. If it's false, then that means that the value is not valid, meaning it could be an alpha character, not a numeric character, and so on. So we're going to say if int.tryParse, and in here, this is going to be a method call. We're going to pass in the console.readLine again, and that's a method call as well. And for the second parameter, we're going to pass out and then the blog ID variable above. And now that squiggly line above goes away because I'm using this variable now. So then we're just going to open up a set of curly braces here. All right. And now all we need to do here is we need to call our add method we are on the post instance. So we're going to say underscore post instance, which is the variable from above that we define. And we're going to call the add method that's within the post class. And that's going to be a method. So I'm going to pass in the blog ID because that's what it expects as an argument. Then I'll pass in the title, and then I'll lastly pass in the content. Content like that. All right. So I think that's all we need here for this. So what that's going to do is basically going to take in these arguments. It's going to attempt to add a new blog post to the database. Now, what happens if the value is not numeric or if it's an invalid value based on the try parse function above? Well, we need to handle that with an else. So we're going to say else on the next line, and then the next line we'll add the curly braces. And within here, we just want to output invalid input. So we're going to say console.writeLine. We're going to say invalid input, try again, and semicolon. All right. So I think that's it for this method in particular. Again, we just want to add a post to the database, and basically the method here, this post instances add method, will then assign the blog ID to the post blog ID field, and we did this before in the other class, so you can review that class if you just need a refresher. All right, let's move on here, guys. Excuse me. So the next thing we want to do is, let's say we want to get, based on the next selection, which I believe is selection number 4, we want to be able to display a list of posts that's related to a specific blog. All right, and so to do this, we're going to need to rely on the blog ID to know which ones to fetch. So, excuse me. Let's define a new method. So we're going to say public static void, and we're going to call this one get posts by blog ID, something like that. Hit enter and then open up the curly braces. So for this one, it's not going to take in any arguments in this method signature above. What we're going to do instead is we're going to say console.writeLine, and then we're going to ask the user to enter the blog ID. And of course, again, the user will enter an integer. So again, we have to do the same code where we say int blog. And in a real life environment, you might want to make this into a separate method if you could. I'm not going to do that right now because I don't want to make things too complex. So we'll just repeat ourselves a little bit here. We're going to say if int.tryParse, And then we're going to do the console.readline again to read the input from the user. And then we're going to have as a second argument the out and then the blog ID again. All right, and then we're going to add the curly braces here. Okay, so far it's similar to the method above. Now the difference here is, again, we want to be able to get all of the posts associated by the blog ID. So now that we're capturing the blog ID from the user, we can use that to do a query lookup for the post that we need. So first, let's define a new list of posts. So we're going to say list post. We're just going to call this post. We could have done var post as well, but I wanted to use things interchangeably just to show you guys how you can do that. And that's going to be set equal to a new list of posts. And again, this empty list of posts is what we're going to return if we do not find any post in the database. So that way we can avoid returning nulls, because null pointer exceptions in .NET are very unforgiving, as I mentioned before. So let's see. Actually, you know what? Let's change this up, guys. What I'm going to do instead is, instead of returning it like this, let me just say list of post. And instead, what I'm going to do is up here, I'm going to directly call, because our method that we define, our getPost method, I think it was called getPost4. That method that we define in the post.cs class takes in the blog ID. And if there is no blog, or if there are no blogs in the database that match the query, then it automatically returns an empty object. So we don't have to redo that here. Instead, of what we can do is say that this is equal to underscore post instance dot get post 4 and then pass in blog ID. So we don't have to repeat ourselves with this. So I think this is a better approach. All right. Cool. All right, so now all we want to do now is somewhere down here, still within the scope of this method, we need to check for the current count of posts. So we want to make sure that we have posts. So we're going to say if post.count is greater than 0. So if we have at least one post in our list, what we need to do is loop through each of them, and then we're going to output the information. So we're going to say for each again, for each var item in post. Okay, and down here we're going to say first output the post ID. So we're going to say console.writeLine and $post ID, and then squiggly braces, and then item.post ID. This is going to be the first one. All right, now we're going to output the title. So console.writeLine, $, double quotes, and for this we'll just say title, and then item.title. And lastly, we're going to say console.writeLine. Let's see, we're going to say just content. So $, double quotes, content, and then curly braces, item.content. All right. And let's see, what else do we want here? I'll go ahead and I'll just output another new line. So I'll just say console.writeLine, but I won't pass any string here. That's just going to do it like a new line character. I could have also done it at the end of this, but I just want to show you guys that this is possible both ways. All right, so that'll just be like an empty line right after it, just to give it some spacing. All right, that looks good. Let's see here. Now, so if we do have a value, we'll output it, or if we do have posts that are getting returned from the database, we'll output them. But what happens if we don't? So again, we need to handle that special case. So I'm going to come back here, and I'm going to add an else statement here. And within this else, I'm just going to say console.writeLine, and we'll just say no post found. That's it. All right, so I guess that will be it for this. I think we've covered mostly everything. We do have to do update and delete though. All right, so let's go down here. We're almost done with this. We just got a couple more. Next we're going to handle the update post. So we're going to say public static void update post. And that's not going to take in any parameter. Okay? Because again, we're going to be asking the user to give us this via the console. That's why we're not passing in anything here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a console.write this time, just to kind of keep things on the same line. Console.write, not write line, but console.write. And I'm going to say here, enter the post ID for the post you want to update. All right. And then obviously we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to say int post ID is equal to 0. Now in this case we're using post ID, not blog ID. That's why I'm saying int post ID is equal to 0. Because again, we want to get the post ID so that way we can update the correct post record. We need that primary keys value. So again, we're going to say if int.tryParse, and then we're going to pass in console.readline. Again, it's kind of like repetitious code. So again, in a real life scenario, you might want to use a separate method to do this, but we're going to say out, and then we're going to pass in the post ID that we defined above to store the value to that. All right, so within this, all I'm going to do is ask the user for the new title and the new content. We're not going to allow the users to change the post ID, okay? Not for this tutorial. So first, let's handle the scenario of changing the title. Let's say console.write line, and we're going to say enter new title. And I guess I can use write line instead of write. That's fine. And for this, we're going to store the title. We're going to say string title is equal to console.readline, and then double question and this. Okay. So secondly, we're going to now grab the content, console.writeLine, and for this, we're going to say enter new content. And then we're going to say here string content is equal to console.readline, double question mark, and double quotes. All right. Lastly, what we need to do to update this is we need to call our update method that we've already defined in our post class. So we're going to say underscore post instance to access that class. And we're going to say dot update. As you can see, my auto suggest found it. That's because we defined this function already. And what this function expects here first is the post ID, followed by the title, and then lastly the content. Now, a quick aside here. Let's say, for example, you had several, arguments. Let's say you had 100 arguments to pass in. Well, it wouldn't be ideal to pass in 100 arguments like this. Instead, what you might want to do is pass in something like an options dictionary or, a values dictionary, which will have like key value pairs, and you would pass that in to this method. And then within the method itself, the update method, you would parse the values from that dictionary. So you would actually grab those values and then assign them accordingly. So, but in this case, we only have 3 arguments, so we don't need to go that far. Okay, let's see. So the other thing we want to do here is we want to handle the else condition, because in the event that it fails, the try parse fails, we want to have the else, and then we're just going to say console.writeLine. And for this, let's just say invalid post ID. Try again. Cool. And I'll save that. All right. Now, I think that should be good to go. And obviously, we're going to test all of this to make sure that this works. We may have to make a few tweaks along the way. All right, one last method. So the last thing is the delete functionality. So this should be rather simple. So we're going to say public static void delete post, no arguments being passed in. And all we want to do is ask the user to enter the post ID. So we're going to say console.write, let's just say console.write, not write line, console.write, enter enter the post ID for the post you want to delete. Yeah, actually, it shouldn't be a question. It should just be a statement. Okay, semicolon. And again, we're going to have to do the same thing. So we're going to say integer post or int post ID is equal to 0 to set that as the default. And then down here, we're going to use the try parse again. So we're going to say if int.try parse. We're going to pass in the console.readLine. Then we're going to pass in this out and then assign the post ID like that. All right. Okay, so within this, it's going to be rather simple. All we need to do is just grab the post and then delete it. Okay. Because again, this, if I go, let's go back to our post class. Let's open up post.cs. Let's go down to delete. So in our delete functionality, if you guys recall, this functionality requires us to pass in a post. Okay, as you can see here, it's asking us to pass in the post for the delete functionality right here. Okay, not the post, not just the post ID, but the entire post object in that case. All right, so let's go back to our data manager. And the first thing we want to do is grab the post. So we're going to just say var post. We could also say post, but I'm just going to use the var here. It's going to be equal to underscore post instance. And in this case, to grab the post, we need to use the get post, the singular one. So we're going to say dot get post singular. Okay, opening and closing. And then we just need to pass in the post ID. Semicolon. So that should get us a single post by its ID. And last but not least, what we need to do now is just call underscore post instance dot delete. Sorry, not dot equals post instance dot delete. Not sure why that's not coming up for me. Is that do delete post? We can change that. I think it's just dot delete, and then we're going to pass in our post. Okay, so I'm getting an error message here. Let's see why. Okay, so post underscore post instance dot delete, and then post. So let's go back. Let's do this. Let's go back to our post.cs class. Let's make sure we spelled the method correctly. DEL. Okay, and it's public. Okay, delete. We called it delete post, did we? No, it's called delete. Not sure why that's happening. Let's go down here. Let's just make sure that this method is where it needs to be. Okay, it should be. All right, let's go back to our data manager, and let's try to see what the problem is here. Now I'm just gonna hover my cursor over this and see. So basically it's saying here it's implicit conversion, convert type underscore. Okay, that should not be the case. System.index. Huh. Not sure what's going on there. Let's try this one more time. Let me just get rid of this because this should work, guys. So I'm not sure what's going on. Let's try it one more time. Let's just type this out again. Post instance. And that we need to call the delete. Now it's showing up. That is really weird. And then we're passing in the post object. Now that works. So I'm not sure what happened there. I may have had one character off, but if you experience the same thing, just try deleting the line and retyping it. Now this should not be a capital P, it should be a lowercase p for post. What happened there? Take my caps lock off. There we go. Let's just bring this in like this. Okay. Sorry about that. Little hiccup. Getting quite late over here, but yeah, basically that's what we need to do here. That's all we really need to do. Now we need to definitely handle the else condition here. So we're just going to make a new line and again do an else statement here. And for this, we're just going to say like invalid post ID again. So we're going to say console.writeLine invalid post ID dot try again dot end semicolon. All right, I think that should be it, guys. Yeah, I think that should be it. So let's go ahead and let's try to build this solution So we're going to just clear this out, and we're going to say here .NET build, just to see if things compile correctly. So let's give that a moment. Okay, so we have one error message here, and it's saying basically the name of console. Yeah, we don't want that. So let's go back to, it's in our program class line 37. So I'm just going to jump to our program.cs class or file. And what was it, line 37? Yes, right here. This is misspelled. So we need to just remove one O. That should do it. Okay, so let's clear our console again. Now, guys, if you notice, before I clear this console, you'll notice we get all of this weird output above. These are just warnings. You can ignore these, but if you wanted to resolve these, you can go one by one and see what the problem is. In most cases, it would be because of a not null. And I can show you guys. In fact, you know what? Let me do that right now. Let me just clear out this console. And let me show you guys what the problem is. So let's open up, for example, our post.cs. Okay. Again, these are not error messages. These are just warnings. So what the problem is, guys, is that if you could see here, we have squiggly lines here. And the reason why we have those is because we're defining title and we're defining other attributes or properties here, but we're not giving it a default value. And normally it's a good practice to give a default value. So that way you know exactly what to expect if this property has not been set. As of the most recent versions of the C#.NET linters, they're really going hard trying to get people to set default values for these properties. So let me show you exactly what we can do here. So for title, we know that this is a string. So let's set a default value of empty string in the event that the title property has not been set. So right after this, I'm just going to say equals string.empty. Now you're probably wondering, why did I not use the double quotes? You can do that, but in this case I like to use the string.empty like this to signify that I'm setting this on a property. Okay, and then similarly down here we're going to say empty here as well, and that should stop the error messages, or rather the warnings there. And let's just check our blog.cs file and see what we got here. Let's scroll all the way up to the top, and we have our name. Okay, so our name is giving us that warning. So we're going to just say here string.empty and semicolon. And for the URL, we're going to say the same thing, string.empty semicolon. All right, that should stop the warnings. Let's run our build again and see .NET build. Let's give that a moment. Okay, as you guys can see, there are no warnings and no error messages. So it looks like we resolved everything there. It's completely built. So now what we want to do, let's just go ahead and run a database migration just to make sure. I just like to do it. There's no harm in doing it. So let's just do it to make sure everything has been fully committed. First, we'll make the migration. So we'll say .NET-ef migrations, add, and let's call this defined models. You can call it anything you want. Hit enter. And that's going to start to build as well. Build succeeded. Cool. So that should have created new migrations files if we've made any changes to our models. And I'm just going to clear out this output. And lastly, what I'm going to do is commit these by actually making the migrations, rather than not making them, but applying them. So we're going to say .NET-ef database update. And hit enter. Give that a moment. And build succeeded there as well, and we're applying any applicable changes that existed. All right, so let me just clear this out. So guys, I think we're ready to test this. So we're going to test every function. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to just close out of this. Actually, you know what? What we haven't done, we're not done yet. I just thought about this. We haven't done, I don't think we've done the case yet. Let's go back to our, let's go back to our cases. So I'm just going to type case 1 here. Yeah, so we haven't even, guys, we haven't even called this yet, but luckily there isn't much to do here, because all we have to do is essentially just call each and every method that we need to reference here. So the first thing we need to do is we created that data manager class so that we can access those methods so that we can reach the data access layer and fetch our data or add or delete or update data. So for the first selection, if the user types a 1 in the console, we want the user to be able to add a new blog or a new blog site. So we're going to go down here to case 1, and above the break, we're just going to add a new line, an indent here with using the tab key. And we're going to type here data manager because we want to call the method that is the add blog site method. Now I could have called it add blog, but I named it add blog site so that it's clear exactly what we're doing, because this the blog object only has a name and a URL property anyway, right? So it doesn't like have any textual data beyond that. All right, so we have this data manager.add blog site that's going to be called when the user enters 1 and hits the enter key. So that's good to go there. We don't have to add any more code to the first case. Now, what if the user hits the 2? So if the user hits 2, we're going to call data manager. And for number 2, it was show all the blogs, available blogs. So we're going to say get all blogs here, like that. All right. And now if the user hits 3, we're going to say data manager. And 3 was to add a new post. So we're going to say add post. All right. And for 4, if the user, number 4 was if the user actually tries to query for post by the ID. And remember, we're asking for the blog ID within the method itself, so there's no need for us to pass it in here. So we're going to say data manager because we want to get a list of posts by the blog ID. So we're going to call the get post by blog ID function that we defined in the data manager class. For number 5, we want to allow the user to update a post. So we're going to call data manager.update post. And then lastly, for number 6, we want the user to be able to delete a post. So we're going to call data manager.delete post. And I think that should be it, guys. We've defined the default here. I just want to see if there's something else we're missing. And the has quit we've defined. I think we're good here. All right, so let's give this a shot here. Let's run another build. We don't have to run migrations because we didn't tamper with the models. We only changed the UI, so we don't have to run migrations again. Instead, let's just run .NET build just to make sure that that worked and compiles. All right, so it looks like that compiles. I'm just going to clear out the console. So now to actually run this application, we need to run .NET run. That's simple. So just type .NET run and hit enter. And now what happened just now, guys, is it cleared out the screen. And let me just kind of go up and show you guys exactly what happened there. We're just going to take step by step. First, let me just get rid of these comments. We don't need them anymore because we've defined all the functionality. So I'm going to get rid of that. And this one as well. Bring this up a notch. All right. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to go back to our show intro feature here, or method. So the show intro is basically outputting what we told it to output. It's welcoming the user to the blog manager, and then right here we also defined the menu. Okay, so it needs to show the menu to the user. Okay, which is within the run selection method here. So if I go into run selection, you'll see here that it's going to take in the user's input. So the show intro method actually shows the menu, and then the run selection will handle the selection. So let's do this. If I just type the number 2 for now, and actually, you know what I'm going to do, guys? Before I move on here, I don't like the way that this cursor is below select the number. So I'm going to go back up to I'm going to do a search for select a number so I can jump straight to it, and it's right here. So instead of doing console.writeLine, I'm going to do console.write. Just going to tweak a few things here. So that way it's on the same line, okay? So let me just exit out of this. To exit, I'm going to hold Control and press C to leave the application. I'll clear it again, and I'll do .NET run again. And now you guys will see that the cursor is on the same line with select the number. So let's first do number 2 here, just to see if we have any blogs. So I'm going to hit number 2, and I'm going to hit enter. It's going to say you selected number 2 and no blogs found, guys. And now it's asking me what I'd like to continue. As we saw before, this was the has quit logic. So let's go back to has quit so you guys can see exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so in the has quit method, we actually have a do while loop, and we're looping through that until the user actually quits the application. So first, let's type in, and I'm going to type a lowercase n to quit the application. And as you guys can see, it's thanking me for using the application, and so it exited. So let me just clear this, and I'm going to go back in with .NET run. And this time I'm going to type 2 again. It's going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to type a Y for yes to continue and hit enter. And as you guys can see, it cleared out the console and essentially just reset everything back to the original state. All right, so this do while loop is working perfectly. So we know that our has quit functionality is working. There's no need to check that any further. Now, what I'm going to do now before we continue is I'm just going to close a few of these tabs here, because what I want to do is I want to open up my database because I want you guys to see the data actually being inserted. So I'm going to expand my DB folder here, and I'm going to click on or double click on the sqlite.db file. And that's going to open up my database as you see here. And again, we have no data currently in blogs. So let's go ahead and add a brand new blog to see if this data actually reaches the database. Let's go back to our program.cs, and in our terminal below, I'm going to use the selection number 1 to add a blog site. So I'll hit 1 here. Now it's asking us to enter a website name, a blog website name. I'm going to call this one the Fantastic Duo, and I'll hit enter. Now it's asking me to enter a URL. I'll just say fantastic.com. Okay. Now, guys, that's probably an actual website, so I'm not, referring you guys to that. So if you type that, at your own risk. Okay. Let's go ahead and hit enter. And now it's asking me the same thing if I would like to continue or exit. So for now, it looks like the blog has been added because we see this message here, blog added. So if I go back to my database file here, now let's see, we should have auto refresh, and yes, we do have the record right here. So the record is right here, guys. Line number 1 here, we have an ID of 1, and that's an auto incremented ID. So every time we insert a brand new record, it's going to increment by 1. And then we have here the Fantastic Duo as a title, and then here we have the URL. So this is working perfectly, and that's within our blog's database table. Now, just to make sure that the actual application can access this, let's go ahead and hit Y here to continue. And now I'm going to hit number 2 and hit enter to see if this gets returned. So once I do that, I see here the blog that I just created. So that part is working. So this is a pass. All right. Awesome. So let's go ahead and hit Y again and hit enter. Let's test some more functionality. So the first 2 selections are working perfectly. You know what? Let's just add another one just for a kick here. Let's just hit 1 again. And let's say here, let's just say unbeknownst. I'm just creating anything. Unbeknownst. Like that. So I'll hit enter, and then I'm going to say ubw, for example, .net. Hit enter. And now that should have added a new blog. So if I hit Y, oh, actually, guys, that's something to test. If I hit R or something else and hit enter, it's basically telling me that I have invalid input. So that was the other special case that we handled in our else statement. So that is also working with regard to our has quit logic. So let me go ahead and let me enter a capital Y to show you guys it's the same thing. And I'll hit enter and it resets. So now that I've entered that second blog site, I'll hit the number 2 again. And again, we see now 2 records being displayed. So we see this list being displayed. So everything is looking good. All right, I'll hit Y again. And now let's try to add a post. So before I do that, actually, Let me hit number 4 to show you guys I don't currently have a post. So right now, I selected 4. It's asking me for a blog ID. I'll just select number 1 because we have one blog, as you see above here in the database table. We actually have 2 blogs, but I'll select blog ID number 1. So I'll hit enter. And here you'll see that there are no posts found, which is part of our else logic in our query here, or in our method. So I'll hit the Y to reset that, and I'm going to add a new post. So I'll hit number 3, and it's asking me to enter a post title. I'll say here, why is the sky blue? All right, and hit enter, and then enter some content. I'm just going to enter in here, this is the first blog post, like that, and I'll hit enter. And now it says that this post has been added, or actually rather it's asking me to select the blog ID. So I'll hit the number 1 again, and now it's saying that the post has been added. I jumped the gun there, but now it's saying that the post has been added. All right, so it looks like we're good there. Let's check to make sure that that definitely hit the database. There are 2 ways we can do that. First, let's do it in the application. So I'll hit Y, and now I'll hit the number 4, guys, as we did before. And now you can see if I enter the blog ID of 1, we're getting back that post. Why is the sky blue? Now, where can I find this in our database? So if I come up here and I click on this arrow, I can select the post table. So let me click on that. And as you folks can see, we have 1 row here currently with the title. We have an auto incremented ID. The first ID is 1. And we have the title, why is the sky blue? And we have our content here. And now also, I'll point out, we have a blog ID of 1. And this is our foreign key on this table that's related to the blog, which is the parent record of this child record, this post. So this is working, and we have the relationship established between a post and a blog. All right, let's try that one more time. I'm going to hit the Y again. I'll go ahead and I'll type 3 to enter another blog post. I'm just going to say here, because I can't think of any other titles, blog post 2. I'll say this is the second post and hit enter. And I'm going to assign this to number 2 this time, blog number 2. Actually, before we do that, what happens if I use a different ID? Let's say number 3. What happens? So basically, it's outputting an error message. As we saw here, error while adding posts. Now, if we wanted to override this, because if you guys recall, this was actually the custom message we displayed. What happens is an exception was thrown and we had a try catch block. And basically, we're outputting the message that was within the catch block. But if you wanted to have like a special message, then you would use like an if-else condition. So let me just go back here and try that again. We'll say number 3. We'll say blog post 2, and we'll say this is the second post, hit enter, and now I'll select blog ID number 2 for this, and hit enter, and it says post added, and I'll hit Y. Now if I go to number 4 to display it, if I enter a post ID of 2, we should only get back 1 post, not 2, because we have 1 post related to blog ID 1, and 1 related to blog ID 2. I'll hit enter, and you folks can see here that I have just 1 post. Now, back in our post table here, you'll see that the first row is related to the first blog of ID 1, and the second one is related to the blog ID of 2. So basically, we have 1 post per blog site currently. So it looks like this is working excellently. There's no further need to test that. Let's hit Y to go back. All right, so now what we want to do is let's go ahead and test the update functionality. So I'll hit the number 5 and enter. Now it's asking me to enter the post ID. So I can enter 1 or 2, as you can see here above in this post column. Let's enter this, let's actually update the second post. So I'll hit number 2. And now it's asking me to enter a new title. So let's see. Let's say the sun and the moon. Why do they matter? Question mark. And I'll hit enter. And then for the post content, I would say the sun and the moon are part of our solar system. We need them. All right, just something, some gibberish. So I'll hit enter. And it says here that the post has been updated, right? So now we can see above immediately that this has been impacted. On line number 2 here, or row 2, we already see the new title and we see the new content. So it's already happening. Now, obviously the blog ID did not change. So this right here, this foreign key value did not change because we're not asking the user to make a change to it. And I didn't want to overcomplicate this solution by introducing that, but that's something that you guys can try as homework. You guys can create another input or output rather, where you're asking the user, you're prompting the user to change the blog ID if they want to. You can give them the option as an optional choice, whether they would like to change it or not. That's a good practice for you guys. So give that a shot. All right, so lastly, what I want to do is I want to hit Y here. I just want to see if this gets returned in the actual application. So I'm going to hit the number 4 again to get all posts. And we're going to grab the post with an ID of 2, the blog with an ID of 2. And we can see here that it has the brand new title, The Sun and the Moon, Why Do They Matter? And the new content as well. Awesome, guys. So let's hit Y, and there's one last thing we need to test. And obviously that's delete a post. So I'm going to hit number 6 here. And here it's asking me to enter a post ID. So I'm going to delete the first post with an ID of 1. So I'll hit 1 here. I'll hit enter. And now it says post deleted. If you look above, now we only have 1 post left. Okay. Now, just for the record, if you were to add another post here, it's basically going to skip to an ID of 3. It won't add another ID of 1 at all. That's because this is an auto-incremented post ID column. So generally, it's not going to repeat a prior ID if the record has been deleted. It's just going to continue iterating and incrementing from the very highest value, in this case being 2, an ID of 2. All right. Okay, so let's do one more thing. Let's try to delete this final post here. So I'm going to click Y again, and I'll try number 6 again. And then I'm going to give a post ID, 2? Post ID of 2. And hit enter, and vamoosh, that one is gone as well. Yeah, and then I'm going to exit the application. Thank you for using the blog manager. So guys, that's pretty much it. In this tutorial, we built a brand new console app using C#.NET entityframeworkcore, and basically we showed the code-first approach to using entityframework. Let me know below in the comments if you guys want to see the database-first approach, which is a bit different. It's essentially using an existing database to create the code and then mapping them together. Also, what we've done is we worked with establishing and defining methods within classes. We worked with the database context we inherited from the DbContext class to extend the functionality and configuration. And yeah, we built a full-scale app. And one thing that you guys might want to try is using ASP.NET, which is essentially the full stack framework for MVC applications. You guys might want to try adding a UI to this, an actual web page to this. So if you guys want to see me do that in a future video, also let me know that. Guys, go ahead and hit the like button on this if this was helpful. Subscribe and hit the bell icon because more videos are coming. And until next time, guys, happy coding.